Our story begins with a promise between a young man and his girlfriend to enter the city's top university together. However, despite his best efforts, he ended up failing his language exams quite spectacularly. In the end, he only scored 600 points, losing his chance at university while she left to study abroad. She never knew he gave up on school entirely, forced to work instead to keep food on his family's table. One night, while dragging his exhausted body home after a long shift, he was suddenly struck by a red car. Immediately, a woman in a red dress approached him, asking if he was all right, though he was too dazed to answer. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a stack of cash, roughly $20,000 or $30,000. She told him to take the money and head to the nearest hospital just in case he was injured. Claiming she had an emergency, she pressed the money into his hand and turned to leave, but then stopped. She quickly scribbled her number on a scrap of paper and handed it over with her ID, telling him to call if he needed anything. Her name was Lily. We see him looking down at the identification card as she hurries away. She was gone in less than a minute, leaving him there without another word of explanation. The white luxury car sped off into the rain. Feeling the ache in his bones, he slowly managed to stand up. With no other choice, he began the long walk home, pushing his broken electric scooter along the pavement. In his hand, he still held the evidence of the encounter and the contact information for the mysterious Lily. By the time noon rolled around the next day, he found himself caught in a brief moment of indecision. He finally picked up the phone and dialed the number. The first time he tried, no one answered. A minute later, he tried calling again. This time, the call was rejected immediately. Feeling a bit disappointed but determined, he decided to try his luck one more time. And this time, to his relief, someone finally picked up the phone. From the other end of the line, we hear that her surroundings are anything but quiet. She asked who it was and what they needed, speaking with a hurried, impatient edge. He replied calmly, and for a moment, it seemed as though the wheels in her mind were spinning. Her attitude shifted instantly, and she began to apologize with genuine sincerity. She asked which hospital he was at and if he had already been examined by a doctor. She wanted to know what the diagnosis was, her voice now filled with a comforting warmth. He told her to stay calm, explaining he was fine, though his electric scooter had certainly seen better days. She insisted that his health was all that mattered before asking for the value of the damaged scooter. He mentioned the money she already gave was plenty, even if he had to pay for the repairs himself. He reminded her that he still had her ID, wondering if she would like to come collect it. She hesitated for a moment, her next question coming out as a soft, uncertain inquiry. She explained she was tied up with work and couldn't leave, asking if a friend could collect it instead. After giving her his address, he hung up and sat on a wooden bench to rest his aching body. About half an hour later, the silence was broken by the sound of someone calling out to him. We see him open the door to find four strangers standing outside his home. The man leading the group appeared to be roughly the same age as our protagonist. The three men standing behind the leader looked quite imposing and firm. The man in front looked him over and asked, rather bluntly, if he was the one who had called. He demanded to know who he was, his questions coming one after another without pause. Finally, he asked if he had Lily's identification card, and he confirmed that he did. The man in front didn't wait for an answer. He struck him suddenly, following it up with a sharp blow to the stomach. Our protagonist was left reeling, barely able to comprehend what was happening to him in that chaotic moment. He was knocked to the ground, and though he tried to stand, the man kicked his legs to keep him down. Immediately, he felt the sharp, unmistakable taste of copper in his mouth. To be honest, things were looking quite grim. Meanwhile, his roommate, who had clearly been drinking, seemed strangely delighted by the unfolding spectacle. The intruder forced his way in, briefly glancing into the bedroom before quickly shutting the door again. The man approached him again, and with a cruel lack of hesitation, he stepped on his hand. He then asked, with a chillingly calm voice, where Lily's identification card was hidden. He tried to speak, but half of his face felt completely numb, making it impossible to form a single word. The man turned around and gave a brief, sharp command to the three imposing figures standing behind him. He told them to go inside and find the ID card along with any other evidence they could find. They found the items quickly on the bedroom desk and handed them over. The leader then asked if he had finally calmed down. He asked if he really thought he could just take advantage of her, promising to make the situation very clear today. He warned him that if he ever dared to lay a finger on that woman again, the consequences would be fatal. After delivering that final warning, he landed one last heavy punch, just to make sure the message was received. He began to walk away, but as he reached the doorway, it seemed as though he remembered one last detail. He returned, grabbed the phone from the bedroom, and smashed it violently against the floor right in front of him. Once he was certain the phone was completely useless, he and his companions finally made their exit. Left alone in the silence, he could do nothing but sit slumped against the side of the bed. As the dust settled, he stared at the wreckage of his room, realizing just how much this encounter had cost him. We see him lost in thought, unable to understand why this world always seems so full of such blatant unfairness. Even less could he fathom why, despite everyone looking so fine, he was the one left beaten over a simple ID card. He knew he had to figure out what that man really wanted. While outside, the rain fell harder, as if it would never stop. When tomorrow's sun finally rises, this city will feel the weight of an even greater impact. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, choosing to illuminate his small, messy room. By then, he had already packed all of his meager belongings into a single suitcase. Today he was leaving this rental. After last night's chaos, the landlord decided he was trouble and kicked him out. He loaded the box onto his old electric scooter, left with only the small sum of money Lily had given him. Just last month, after receiving his salary, he had sent every cent home to cover his father's medical treatments. He had kept only a tiny amount for himself, barely enough to cover his own basic protection and daily expenses. From his remaining cash, he spent $800 on a cheap smartphone and some basic cooking supplies. The work had to continue, and he planned to use his last bit of savings to find a new place to live. If he couldn't find a suitable room before dark, he would be forced to sleep under the shadows of the skyscrapers. He carefully inserted the SIM card into the new phone he had just purchased. The moment he turned it on, he received an unexpected call from his uncle. His uncle, Charlie, was a formidable man who always seemed to know exactly what was going on. His uncle had practically raised him on the streets, being only 6 years older than our protagonist. To be honest, his uncle was something of a brilliant rogue. Sitting by the road, he told him he was finally free. He asked his uncle why he was looking for him and if something specific had happened. It turned out his uncle had gone to the pharmacy to pick up the necessary medication for his father. He had heard that over in Conglomerate, there was a specialized doctor who was exceptionally skilled at treating this virus. After a bit of searching, Charlie had finally managed to track down the old doctor's contact information. He was heading there in a hurry and planned to stay the night, promising to buy a return ticket the next morning. Upon hearing his uncle's plan, our protagonist immediately felt a wave of nervous tension wash over him. We can only imagine his worry. If his uncle saw his current living situation, what on earth would he think? If word got back to his father, both of them would end up worrying themselves sick all over again. Besides, his face was still visibly bruised, and knowing Charlie's stubborn nature, he would surely demand answers. It was shaping up to be a massive problem, leaving him momentarily speechless and unable to find the right words. He quickly told his uncle not to come looking for him, suggesting he just head back home once he had the medicine. He claimed to be far too busy, but Charlie insisted, mentioning that his mother had even sent along a carton of eggs. She had been very clear that he must receive them, and so, the matter was settled for the time being. Charlie promised to call again soon, and then abruptly hung up the phone, leaving him in a bind. At this point, trying to find a proper apartment to rent on such short notice simply wasn't practical. With only 2 hours left before his uncle arrived, time was rapidly running out for him to find a solution. This was a genuine crisis, and for a brief moment, he felt a flicker of frustration at the sheer timing of it all. He decided his best bet was to head toward the station and find a small hotel where he could settle his uncle in. The goal was simple: convince Charlie to stay there instead of seeing the reality of his nephew's current life. As long as his uncle was comfortable and well-fed, he didn't particularly care where he ended up sleeping himself. He was sure he could handle it, and 2 hours later, we see him waiting to pick up his uncle at the station. Just like before, Charlie arrived looking sharp in his Nike gear, his athletic build making quite an impression on the crowd. We see that he still had a few tricks up his sleeve, but the moment they met, Charlie was deeply concerned. He immediately asked, "Chris, what on earth happened to you? Who have you been fighting with?" His explanation was clumsy at best, claiming he had simply had a bit of an accident and fallen down. Naturally, his uncle didn't believe a word of it, knowing full well that Chris was trying to play him for a fool. He asked if Chris really intended to lie to his own family, pointing out that no one gets bruises like that from a simple fall. It was a difficult situation, as he knew his uncle had already been through so much hardship lately. It was hard to keep deceiving him, but deep down, he still wasn't ready to reveal the messy truth of his life. Trying to keep the mood light, he urged his uncle along, promising to take him somewhere to rest first. He promised to help find the specialist later, and without another word, Charlie followed him into the city. Upon arriving at the small hotel where he had pre-booked a room, he told his uncle this would be his home for the night. He explained that after they found the doctor, he would have to head back to work immediately. He pleaded with Charlie not to tell his father about the injuries, insisting there was no need for anyone to worry. But his uncle was persistent, repeatedly asking what had truly happened to lead to such a state. He demanded to know who had laid a hand on him, calling out to Chris for the honest truth. He asked why he was hiding things from his own family and insisted on knowing who was responsible for the beating. Feeling cornered and irritable, Chris snapped back that he didn't even know why he had been targeted. He began to recount the events of the previous night, though he nearly forgot how observant his uncle could be. Once again, he begged him to keep this a secret from his father to avoid causing unnecessary stress. He then pulled out a few $100s he had managed to save up and set them aside. He asked his uncle to take the money back with him and give it to his father once he returned home. Chris remained silent for a few moments, letting the weight of the situation settle between them. Finally, Charlie spoke up, reassuring him that he wouldn't say a single word to Chris's father. He explained that he had brought $20,000 with him, so Chris shouldn't worry about sending money home. Instead, Charlie insisted on giving him $2,000 to find a decent place to live and rent a room. Chris hesitated, telling his uncle to be careful and that he really didn't need the money. He didn't want to take it, but his uncle was quite persuasive and spoke with such smooth conviction. Charlie told him to just take the money and stop arguing about it. A classic uncle move, really. He promised that later on, he would go and find the medical specialist for Chris's father. But first, he wanted Chris to find a home and get his living situation sorted out once and for all. They planned to have dinner together that night, as Charlie would be taking the bus back home the next morning. Chris took a deep breath, feeling the genuine warmth and care his uncle had for him and his father. Though he didn't want his uncle to worry so much, he eventually decided to accept the suggestion. And so, they split up for the afternoon. Chris went to look for a room while Charlie sought out the doctor. His father's chronic illness had persisted for many years, and the cost of treatment had long since drained the family's savings. Even though his other uncle had left behind a small fortune before passing, Charlie had kept nothing for himself, spending it all on the father's care. While Charlie could be a bit reckless with money at times, his character and loyalty were beyond reproach. A little later, Chris found a small place near the subway, a modest room in a shared apartment. The rent was $700 a month, with a shared bathroom and kitchen, which was practical enough for his needs. We see that the other 2 rooms in the apartment were occupied by another man, and a woman lived there as well. After seeing the room, Chris decided the conditions were reasonable for the price. By the time he finished all of this, it was already 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Our protagonist received a message from Uncle Charlie, who was waiting at a seafood restaurant near the station for their dinner. Since Charlie had to take the bus back home early the next morning, this was their last chance to catch up. Just as Chris was about to head out, he ran into the woman who lived in the same apartment. She was just leaving, dressed in a sharp professional outfit with a short skirt that gave her a very polished look. As she leaned down to change her shoes, Chris caught a glimpse of her skirt, an awkward moment, to be sure. He was certain it wasn't intentional on her part, but he found the situation rather distracting. It was one of those sights that, once seen, is quite difficult to simply ignore. Even after she finished with her shoes and stood up, Chris found his gaze lingering a bit too long on her. She glared at him, her voice dropping to a low, stern tone as she called him out without a hint of fear. After delivering her sharp warning, she adjusted her hat and headed out the door. Later that evening, Chris enjoyed dinner with Uncle Charlie. Not wanting to return to his old place, he stayed in a small hotel. The following morning, he said his goodbyes to Charlie and saw his uncle off. With no steady job or income yet, Chris spent his time working as a delivery driver to make ends meet. He kept himself busy with deliveries until 11:30 at night, when a final request caught him completely by surprise. As it turned out, the delivery was for Linda, the woman he shared the apartment with. When he arrived to drop off the food, his housemate was nowhere to be seen. The doors were shut and the lights were all dimmed, but suddenly, the sound of a ringing phone broke the silence. He set his things aside, placing his jacket on the bed as he looked around. Holding the food, he approached her room and gave the door a gentle, hesitant knock. As she was putting her clothes away, she caught sight of Chris's face and her expression soured instantly into one of pure annoyance. To his complete surprise, she reached out and placed her hand directly against his chest. Then, with a sudden movement of her right hand, she brushed her clothes aside. She questioned him sharply, repeating herself as she insisted that he was the one who would end up ruining her clothes. She tossed her things into a trash bag by the window, and as she took the food container from him, Chris ended up resting the meal on his lap. The bag of soup was scalding hot against him, but she didn't seem to notice or care at all as she took a cold step back. She slammed the door shut, leaving him standing there in the quiet hallway, feeling restless and unable to simply go back to bed. Suddenly, a notification popped up on his phone showing a negative rating, with a complaint asking why he had delivered the food to the wrong person. The message called him irresponsible, and as he stared at the screen, he couldn't help but feel a bit foolish about the whole situation. That single bad review came with a heavy price, a fine of $300. To be honest, a full day of hard work from dawn until dusk barely brought in that much money. He had worked like a dog all day, yet this one mistake had sent him right back to square one. Around noon that weekend, we see Chris receive an unexpected phone call from his second uncle, Mark. Thinking it was just a casual chat, he pulled his electric scooter to the side of the road and asked what was going on. He explained he was in the middle of deliveries and promised to call back later when he was free. But Mark insisted, telling Chris that he was already waiting for him down by the main city streets. He told Chris to stop taking orders and come over immediately, leaving our protagonist wondering if he had heard correctly. Mark asked where he was, mentioning the small apartment complex and claiming that Chris had been involved in a car accident. The confusion grew as Mark told him to come explain the accident, making Chris wonder what Linda was up to now. The uncle sounded baffled, asking why he hadn't gone home and why on earth he had returned to the city. Mark told him he would help recover his belongings, threatening to check more security footage if Chris didn't show up immediately. Chris was left completely speechless, knowing that his second uncle was truly one of the few good people he had left. He quickly sent over his location and began rushing toward the meeting point as fast as he could. As it turned out, we see him spot his Uncle Mark waiting right there on the path leading to the apartment complex. The man was standing right in the middle of the street, and Chris watched him, wondering what could possibly be going through his mind. The moment Mark caught sight of him, he asked with concern if Chris had actually been hit by a car. Chris's perspective on his uncle shifted slightly as he clarified that no, he hadn't been the one hit by a vehicle. He explained that he had merely bumped into a man named Robert while the other was making a turn. Mark couldn't help but point out the obvious. Everyone knows you must yield to oncoming traffic when making a turn. When Mark demanded to know where the man was, Chris pointed ahead and told him exactly where to find him. Chris pleaded with his uncle not to cause a scene, reminding him they had no allies here and shouldn't go looking for trouble. But Mark was determined, insisting he knew what happened and would find the person responsible once he tracked down Robert's order. He told Chris to mind his own business and asked if he was still staying over at the Paris Spring Apartments. When asked if he was coming over tonight, Mark simply told him not to worry and walked away without another word. We watch as Mark's back disappears into the dense crowd, leaving Chris feeling a growing sense of nervous tension. The people involved were clearly not the friendly sort, especially those driving around with Robert. They were carrying designer bags worth over $10,000, hardly the type of people you want to cross. Despite having no connections in this part of the city, Mark continued his investigation without a hint of hesitation. Deep down, Chris was dying to know what his uncle might actually discover. He felt a flicker of worry, but ultimately decided to let his uncle handle things his own way for now. Chris tried to stop him, but Mark didn't seem moved by his pleas in the slightest. No, he insisted, they were going to recover what belonged to them this very day. We see Chris glance around, noting that although it was already past 8 in the evening, the area was still buzzing with energy, a world that clearly didn't belong to them. As they waited, a woman named Chloe handed him a small pack of cigarettes. With a subtle gesture, she pointed toward a black sedan parked nearby. She told him to go sit in the car and simply wait for the others to arrive. When he asked whose car it was, she told him not to worry and just get inside. The moment he sat down in the vehicle, a wave of nervous tension washed over him. Even the car itself, a 10-year-old model, seemed to reflect the stress of the moment. Right by the steering column, he noticed a set of keys wrapped in a simple tissue. This, quite obviously, was the tool for whatever business was about to go down tonight. He found it impossible to relax, even though a part of him was desperate for this to be over. But from the very beginning, his nerves were getting the better of him. He was told that since he was in the car and had the $5 million, he could just leave. Chloe laughed twice, warning him that if he didn't hand it over, he wouldn't be going anywhere. It occurred to him that perhaps even Alicia knew this man in a professional capacity. Meanwhile, Mark's friends watched in surprise as he opened the bag he had been carrying. "Don't hurt him, and I'll give it to you," he said, as he prepared to hand over the money. He placed all of his uncle's money inside, an unknown amount, and gave them everything. Chloe urged him to look quickly, noting that the money already belonged to him now. He found it impossible to look away from the man. He was, quite frankly, strikingly handsome. His features were so delicate that words failed to describe them, and as he watched, she watched him back. In that moment, a wave of awkwardness washed over him, and he quickly averted his gaze. As he got into the car, Chloe noticed his hesitation and asked him a question with a hint of disappointment. She asked if he was afraid or just a coward, reminding him that everyone has 2 hands and 1 head. She couldn't understand why he feared them and told him he should be the one dealing with them. To be perfectly honest, he was more than just a little worried about the situation. Having lived as a simple villager for years, he preferred avoiding conflict and staying out of trouble. His only goal was to work hard and provide for his family, specifically his father's mounting expenses. Chloe told him not to look so foolish, promising to handle anyone who dared to pressure him. She insisted he keep the bag of money, regardless of whether he agreed with the arrangement or not. Knowing his father's medical bills would be astronomical, he didn't argue and kept the $60 million. She told him not to worry about his life in the city, repeating her warning to watch those who crossed him. There had always been a vast gulf between his uncle's world and his own simple life at the night markets. This money felt far too easy to obtain, and deep down, he even considered returning it to Alicia. He told himself this guilt was just his nature, but he couldn't allow himself to be burdened by it. He hoped to at least leave a decent impression on Alicia, though he realized how complicated that would be. The next day, he finally allowed himself to sleep until he woke naturally, feeling a rare sense of peace. He then opened his delivery app, accepting a large first order of 40 meals for a distant lounge. The security guard instructed him to take the elevator and deliver the meals directly to the lounge. For the first trip, he only carried 20 orders. It seemed these specific orders were intended only for the women working in the private testing rooms. The second delivery request was much larger, requiring 40 meals to be sent to the overseas lounge, followed by another large batch. Once again, we see that these particular orders were exclusively for the women in the testing area. A third request came in for 40 more meals, all destined for that same restricted area where the women were working. It was a repetitive task, delivering meal after meal to the same group of women. The orders kept coming. He had no idea what would happen next or who he would face. Shortly after, while the 2 guards napped, he tried to escape. But with his limbs seemingly frozen to the chair, his efforts were useless. 3 hours passed before the sound of the door closing echoed. The guards bolted awake as Alicia appeared with 5 others, including a young girl who was there for the day's meal. Among the group were the lady's colleague, a clothing manager, and 2 additional security personnel. As Alicia entered, the guards scrambled to their feet and greeted her, but she simply frowned and asked why the girl was tied up. The manager, seeing the heavy-set guard's mistake, immediately demanded to know who ordered her to be bound and told them to release her. Alicia told the crowd surrounding her to leave the room and barred anyone else from entering. Her voice was so firm that no one dared argue. They filed out quickly, and Alicia looked at him coldly, asking what his relationship was with Gary and why he had been so aggressive. Now he finally knew the man's name was Gary, though Alicia called him a fool for hitting someone without even knowing why. She noted they were always fighting instead of talking and wondered aloud if violence ever actually solved their problems. Alicia seemed to view him with utter disdain, but he looked back at her and calmly asked if she would listen to his explanation. She claimed she had no time, telling him without emotion that he must not refuse tomorrow's gala, and if he needed money, he should just ask. He felt a surge of anger then, looking at Alicia and asking if she had really kept him trapped there for 4 hours just for that. He asked Alice how she could possibly justify keeping him there all night just to tell him something so foolish, his anger rising with every word. Since she had things to say, he decided he had a few things to share as well, starting with a question about that first meal box he delivered. He bluntly told her that he had spat into the food she had been eating. Alice's eyes widened in shock as the realization hit her. She immediately clamped her mouth shut and rushed off to wash, leaving him to grab his phone and finally step out into the fresh air. It was a small victory, perhaps, but in this strange world of ours, one takes what one can get. However, the peace didn't last long, as we soon find him in a far more precarious situation. The scene shifts, and we see him caught in a tense confrontation that seems to have escalated far beyond a simple misunderstanding. The atmosphere was heavy with a sense of impending trouble. He found himself in the back of a commercial van, his hands and feet bound tightly, while his captors watched him from the opposite seats. They were so worried he might try something that they even wrapped chains around him. 2 guards sat behind him, while another watched from the front. Feeling the tension, he turned to Alice and asked what she intended to do, joking nervously that she surely wouldn't kill him over a few bites of food. Alice looked at him with pure dissatisfaction, threatening to throw him from the moving vehicle if he didn't stay quiet and follow her lead. She calmly explained that she didn't care about his lost job, but if Gary was hurt, she would take him straight to court without a second thought. When she revealed that Gary was actually her brother, he felt a surge of genuine nerves and asked if the man was seriously injured. She claimed his friend had kidnapped her brother and she was using him as a trade. He wondered which of his great friends could have done such a thing. It turned out to be Charlie, and the realization made him feel like his head was about to explode. Things were spiraling out of control again. He found it hard to believe Charlie was capable of this, but he didn't dare ask more questions as they drove in silence toward the outskirts of the city. Eventually, they arrived at a rundown hall where a table was set up between 2 cars, covered in food boxes and leftover barbecue. Dozens of empty beer cups littered the area where Charlie sat alone on one side, facing Alice's group who surrounded him from all directions. The men looked dangerous and irritable, and even Alice seemed to lose her nerve as she stepped out of the car to face the situation. We see Alice rush toward the group, asking Gary who had dared to strike him. Gary, looking quite pathetic, pointed toward Charlie as if he were an older brother seeking protection. The heavy-set security guards finally untied him from the van, while the others scrambled up from the ground, shouting threats about killing them if their young mistress wasn't respected. Charlie looked on with a surprised expression, remaining silent as Alice's brother told him to leave. Alice, however, stood up with a glass of wine, her eyes fixed on Charlie. She demanded to know if he was the one who beat her brother, noting that everything seemed fine yesterday. Gary quickly told her to stay quiet, hanging his head in shame. He admitted it wasn't Charlie's fault but his own, confessing that even with 5 men, they couldn't win. To be honest, if we hadn't heard it ourselves, we wouldn't believe it. The 4 men Alice brought were certainly imposing, but Charlie had already defeated them all single-handedly. Alice, clearly shaken, began to wave her hands in disbelief. She gently touched Gary's face, asking if he could truly not handle the situation. Gary looked away, admitting it wasn't the first time he'd been beaten, but this felt different. He claimed this was the first person to actually wound his pride, insisting it wasn't the guard's fault. Charlie finally interrupted, noting that Alice was certainly capable since she'd kidnapped his friend. He demanded they release his brother immediately so they could all leave, promising that the day's expenses wouldn't be an issue if they just settled this now. It was a tense negotiation, one where the stakes involved defeating a master and settling a debt that had grown far too complicated for a simple afternoon. Charlie spoke up, telling Alice he knew things had gone wrong and pleading with her not to cry. He admitted that the fight the previous night had been a mess. He explained that he had called some friends to teach a lesson, never expecting such a low-level outcome where 5 men couldn't win. He promised no more trouble if she'd just stop crying. He called out from the side, asking them to untie him first while they were still arguing. They were busy discussing a prisoner exchange, but he was still stuck in the middle. He wondered aloud if they could show a little mercy, considering Alice's brother was safe and sound. It was a reasonable request, all things considered. Alice signaled the guard, who quickly released him. She was still worried about Gary, asking him why he had gone looking for trouble the night before without telling her. Gary shouted back that Charlie had intercepted his car and followed him home to attack him. He even claimed Charlie broke his phone, accusing Alice of knowing all along. As she listened to these accusations, Alice looked at him with a completely blank expression for several seconds. She then turned back to Gary, who lowered his gaze. He told her he didn't dare look her in the eye because he had lied. He confessed that on that night, he hadn't told her the truth about the person in the car. He claimed he thought they were forcing her and holding her ID card hostage to blackmail her. It was a classic misunderstanding, or perhaps just a very convenient excuse. He explained that he took his friends to the house to rescue her ID. He was still worried the other party had her number and would trick her, so they acted as they left. We see Charlie explain how he even destroyed her phone number, while Alice's voice grew softer and softer as the truth of that night finally came to light, leaving her completely stunned. Then Gary, the man who had caused all this, seemed to shrink into his clothes as if trying to hide. He was terrified, to be honest, and Charlie asked if she finally had time to listen. He suggested she listen to her brother's explanation instead, clarifying how they had tricked him out of his car, sent men to beat him, and even had their manager frame him today. Between the food platform issues and losing his job, Charlie noted that this was all they're doing. He wondered why they were hurting him so much when he hadn't even provoked them. Alice's face turned a deep shade of red as she offered to compensate him, but Charlie simply thanked her and declined, feeling that money couldn't fix everything in this situation. He told her she could do as she pleased, then walked over to his friend, his second uncle, and finished a beer in one go before setting the bottle aside with a heavy sigh. Charlie admitted he hadn't realized his friend was such a capable fighter. The older man just nodded, stood up, and addressed Alice with a calm, formal tone. He told her that while she seemed like a reasonable person to talk to, she had clearly been deceived by those around her regarding the car and the confrontation. He pointed out that after the broken phones and making Charlie lose his job, she was still trying to offer a simple solution, which felt a bit hollow given the circumstances. We see him argue that they simply couldn't accept such an unbelievable series of insults anymore. And who could blame him, really? Alice, still blushing from the embarrassment of the revelation, asked how much money they were looking for to settle the entire matter once and for all. The older man thought for a moment and suggested she forget the cash. Instead, he told her to take Gary home to his father and perhaps offer Charlie a new job. Alice hesitated, saying that wasn't quite what they wanted. While she and Charlie locked eyes, she whispered that their company didn't usually hire people this way. Charlie asked a pointed question, noting his dissatisfaction with her attitude and wondering why his friend was being treated as if he had done something wrong. Suddenly, Alice became anxious, pointing out that Charlie had eaten her food, and quite a lot of it, too, which made Charlie break into a small, involuntary laugh. He told his friend not to worry about the job and to just let things be, asking Alice for a simple promise that she wouldn't cause him any more trouble. He looked her in the eye and asked if he could trust that she wouldn't try to kidnap him or his friends ever again. Alice's face turned red again as she admitted she actually admired Charlie's spirit, suggesting that he could even come and work directly alongside her in the future. Ignoring her offer for the moment, the older man decided the matter was settled and led Charlie back to his old car, a beat-up Santana parked nearby. As they walked away, he asked Charlie with genuine concern if he had really taken down that entire crowd of thugs all by himself. Charlie asked him with a look of pure confusion if doing something like that was really supposed to be difficult. We see that Charlie was left speechless by his friend's prowess. As the older man drove him back toward the city center, he asked Charlie what his plans were for the future. He wondered if Charlie would keep working as a delivery driver, but Charlie explained his account was closed, so he'd simply find something else. Before they parted, the man made a promise. He told Charlie to call if he ever needed anything, and as Charlie stepped out of the car, he felt a strange sense of displacement he had never experienced before, having spent every morning and night working. He had spent his life delivering food, hoping for a day when he wouldn't be so busy, but now that the day had arrived, he found himself not knowing what to do next as he sat by the roadside. Watching the city from the curb, the air felt quite cold, and a stray dog slowly approached him, turning around as if to inspect the stranger. The two lonely souls sat there together for a while, and it wasn't until much later that Charlie finally woke up at 7:30 the next morning. He instinctively reached for his delivery bag, only to remember that his account was still deactivated. He had no deliveries to make and no schedule to keep today. Then he remembered his scooter. It was still parked back at the Grand Hotel where everything had gone wrong the day before, and he wondered if it was even still there. He quickly threw on some clothes and called for a ride straight to the hotel entrance, where he immediately spotted the same chubby security guard from the previous day. The guard was on duty and, upon seeing Charlie, gripped his baton and asked if the boy was looking for trouble or perhaps another beating. Charlie was in no mood for games and asked quite sharply where his scooter had gone. The guard just tightened his grip and lied straight to his face, claiming there was no scooter there and telling him to get lost before things got ugly. Charlie stood his ground, demanding to know who had stolen the bike he had left right in that spot just yesterday. When he asked to see the security footage, the guard let out a mocking laugh, asking in a condescending tone if Charlie really thought he had the right to view this hotel's private records. The guard seemed to enjoy the situation immensely, continuing to taunt him by saying that a cheap scooter like his wasn't worth anyone's time. He even joked that the police wouldn't bother opening a case for someone who looked like a common beggar, but his smug attitude shifted the moment a manager appeared. The guards suddenly adopted a professional stance, wondering who could be arriving to cause such a stir at the entrance. Charlie turned around to see Alice pulling up beside him on her white motorcycle. She looked at him and asked what on earth he was doing back there. He replied with a look of pure misery, asking her if she honestly thought he would ever choose to visit such a terrible place willingly. Charlie explained he was looking for his scooter that had vanished since yesterday, but the chubby guard stepped in, telling Alice she shouldn't bother with a man like him. Alice ignored the guard's dismissive attitude and asked Charlie directly how they were going to resolve this and where exactly his scooter was. The guard claimed that while he was on duty yesterday, he saw the local traffic police arrive and take the scooter away with his own eyes. Charlie was completely displeased, wondering why they would just toss his bike into a truck and take it without leaving him any kind of notice. He had only come there to deliver food, and it seemed absurd that on top of losing his job, they had to take his only means of transportation too. He wondered if these people had any humanity left, while the guard just closed his eyes with a smug, mocking attitude, as if helping Charlie was beneath him. Alice, sensing the guard's hostility, grew concerned and firmly ordered him to give Charlie an elevator card and escort him up to her office. After giving the order, she headed toward the garage to park her motorcycle, leaving the guard in a state of utter confusion. The guard could hardly believe his ears. To be honest, he was struggling to understand why a high-ranking manager would care about a delivery boy. Alice snapped at him, asking if he was deaf, and made it clear that she was personally inviting Charlie to her private office. And so, the guard reluctantly led Charlie up to the 29th floor, where the executive offices were located. The sign on the door read, General Manager, making it clear that Alice was actually the one running the entire hotel. It was truly impressive to see someone reach such a powerful position at such a young age, a fact that wasn't lost on Charlie. As we see him enter, Charlie realized that Alice's office was easily the most luxurious and valuable room he had ever stepped foot in. Alice personally prepared a cup of coffee for him and, after handing it over, began to ask him about the situation with his bike. She asked him how much the scooter was worth, but for some reason, Charlie felt a sudden urge to challenge her perspective. Looking at her, he asked if money was really the only thing she saw when she looked at his property. He told her that he had been riding that specific scooter for 3 years, and it meant far more to him than its market price. From the very first day he started delivering food, that scooter had been his only constant companion through every shift. After enduring so many hardships together, it felt like a cruel twist of fate that his career and his bike were both taken away in a single day. Alice remained remarkably calm as she leaned against her desk, holding her cup of coffee and watching him intently. Looking at him, she asked why he spoke as if he shared some profound, spiritual connection with a mere scooter. She noted that, at this stage, she couldn't exactly call the police to demand they return his bike immediately. She suggested he go grab a meal instead, asking if he was simply waiting for her to offer him money. Charlie felt a sting of resentment, wondering if money was truly the only language she knew how to speak. Alice replied with a cold, professional edge, stating that with someone of his questionable character, money was the only logical topic. She questioned his sense of ethics, pointedly asking if a moral person would ever stoop to stealing someone else's food. Charlie found himself momentarily speechless, truly at a loss for how to defend himself against such a blunt accusation. Alice picked up her phone and glanced at the screen, telling him not to waste any more of her time while she waited for a call. She offered to give him a contact number, insisting she would pay whatever amount was necessary to settle the matter. Finding a sudden spark of defiance, Charlie raised his voice, firmly telling Alice that he didn't want her money, he only wanted his bike back. She ignored his protest, coldly asking if $5,000 would suffice, or perhaps $8,000 to be sure. He hadn't even responded yet, but she was already judging him, assuming he was just holding out for a higher price. He looked at her in disbelief, wondering if she truly believed his integrity could be bought so easily. Alice grew impatient and snapped that if $20,000 wasn't enough, he should leave her office immediately and never show his face again. She dismissed him with a sharp gesture of her hand, clearly finding his entire existence and his struggles to be utterly ridiculous. Charlie realized that in her world, money was the only metric of value, leaving her unable to comprehend the pain of losing a friend. To be honest, trying to talk to her about feelings or memories was proving to be a complete waste of time. He told her to keep her money and live her cold, lonely life before bidding her a final, bitter goodbye. And with that, he turned his back on the luxury of the office and walked straight toward the door. Alice called out for him to wait, standing behind him with a look that suggested he might one day regret this decision. She offered him one last chance, proposing a staggering compensation of $200,000 instead. Charlie simply told her he didn't need it and continued his walk toward the exit. Seeing his resolve, Alice shifted her tone, suggesting that perhaps she could offer him her assistance instead of just money. She promised that if he ever needed help, she would respond, provided his request didn't violate her personal principles. It was a rare gesture of support, a standing offer to help him as long as he stayed within the bounds of her rules. She told him to remember her number and mentioned she was staying at the Kate International Hotel. To be honest, he just wanted to say a quick goodbye and move on with his life after all this drama. He thought about the 2,000 he'd already lost and wondered why he had just refused such a fortune to impress this wealthy woman. In reality, he had played the part of the man of integrity perfectly, even if that performance cost him a small fortune. He wondered how he would protect himself now, though he had at least managed to get Alice's contact information. Well, he supposed that having a powerful ally was its own form of protection in this unpredictable world. Upon his return, while scrolling through his social feed, he accidentally stumbled upon a post from an old acquaintance named Lily. As it turned out, today was her birthday. Lily had been a classmate of his back in their student days. During their time at the academy, he and Lily had actually shared a very close and friendly bond. In their language classes, where boys were a rare sight, the two of them always shared a desk right in the front row. In every single lecture, we see that Lily and Charlie always managed to snag the very best seats in the house. It was always the two of them, side by side, from the very first class they ever attended together. After graduation, Lily earned a score of 590 and was accepted into the prestigious Arlen University. Charlie had actually scored higher with 600 points, yet he had somehow ended up on a very different path. Unfortunately, his family simply didn't have enough money to send him to such an expensive school. On top of that, his father was struggling with a chronic illness that required constant, costly medical treatment. Deep down, he felt he had no choice but to start working early to support his family. 4 years ago, while Lily headed off to university, Charlie began his life in the workforce. At first, they met up often, but as their social circles drifted apart, they eventually lost touch. Yet the old bond remained, and after seeing Lily's post, he sent a quick birthday wish to his old friend. Lily replied almost instantly through a message, asking Charlie if he happened to be free that evening. She invited him to her birthday celebration, noting that it had been far too many years since they last spoke. He replied that it had indeed been a long time, realizing she must have already finished her degree by now. She confirmed she was finally out of school and was currently on the hunt for an internship. When he asked about her plans, she explained that she had studied business management at the university. She had already turned down a few offers, as she was specifically looking for a role in hotel management. She suggested they meet up tonight on the main street to catch up properly. She even teased him to bring his girlfriend along, which made him reflect on how different his life might have been. If he had gone to university, perhaps he too would be calmly discussing his future career in management. It seems some people get to choose their path in life, while others have their path chosen for them. A girlfriend? He wondered if he would ever actually find someone to share his life with. Suddenly, he thought of Lisa. Hadn't she promised him something recently? He wondered if he could actually take Lisa to the dinner and introduce her to Lily. After all, didn't Lisa need someone reliable like Lily to work in hotel management? We learned that Lisa is actually the general manager of a prestigious international hotel group. Charlie realized that even if he couldn't get Lily a job there directly, Lisa could at least provide an introduction. He truly hoped he could provide Lily with some valuable professional resources. And so, he gave Lisa a call, and to his relief, she picked up almost immediately. She got straight to the point, asking if he was calling because he wanted that reward money after all. He joked with her, asking if she really believed he was the type of person who only cared about money. Lisa laughed, keeping her emotions carefully guarded, and asked him what it was he actually wanted then. She reminded him of his promise to accept her help, wondering if he was still a man of his word. He admitted he was, then asked if she would join him that evening for a friend's birthday celebration. He told her he simply wanted to have dinner, noting that such a request surely didn't go against her principles. It wasn't too much to ask, was it? Just a simple dinner between acquaintances. Lisa spoke into the phone, sounding surprised that he specifically wanted her company for a meal. She asked if he thought she had nothing but free time, adding that she wouldn't force herself to go if she didn't want to. Deep down, Charlie wanted to see what kind of person Lisa truly was behind her professional mask. He suspected that beyond her focus on money, she was someone who didn't always say what she meant. As she weighed her decision, Lisa sounded a bit disappointed, perhaps doubting his true intentions. He told her to wait for him, promising they would spend time together once the dinner was over. She made him promise that he wouldn't just make her sit there and watch him eat the entire time. He reassured her that he wouldn't make things difficult. He simply wanted her to show up by his side. Lisa finally agreed, saying it was fine and that she understood the plan perfectly. As the night of the meeting arrived, Charlie felt a spark of excitement, eager to introduce Lisa to his old friend Leo, whom he hadn't seen in 6 months. On his way out, he stopped at a shop to buy a gift, spending $500 on a red envelope, a gesture of respect for the occasion. To be perfectly honest, $500 was no small amount for someone in Charlie's position. He assumed Leo's friends would mostly be students, and we know how energetic and lively students can be these days. He worried for a moment that his gift might be too modest, fearing he might inadvertently cause Leo some embarrassment. By 6:15, Charlie arrived at the restaurant entrance, right on schedule. We see that Lisa's white car was already parked there, waiting for him. As soon as she saw him appear, she stepped out of the vehicle and walked over to join him. She was dressed in sharp business attire, and Charlie couldn't help but look her up and down as he stood at the entrance. Lisa caught his gaze and stared back, dryly asking if he was quite finished inspecting her. She teased him, asking if he was disappointed that he hadn't told her to wear something more special for the evening. She explained that she truly hadn't had any time to change her clothes before coming. After receiving his call, she had come directly from the office without a moment's delay. Charlie simply smiled, telling her that her work clothes didn't look like a uniform at all. In fact, she looked quite stunning. That compliment earned him another sharp look from Lisa as he led her inside, where they found Leo already seated at a large table. Leo was deep in conversation with another man, surrounded by a group of about 10 people in the private room. The moment Leo spotted him, he stood up and called out, relieved that Charlie had finally arrived since everyone was waiting. Charlie told him to stay seated, while Leo gestured for a man sitting next to him to move over and make space. When Charlie reached the spot, he offered a bottle of wine to the man who had given up his seat as a polite thank you. However, the man just looked at him coldly and refused to accept the gesture, which, naturally, made things a bit awkward. The man spoke with an air of self-importance, making it quite clear to everyone at the table that he had his own way of doing things. Leo then turned to the group to introduce his guest, proudly presenting Charlie as his best friend from their old neighborhood school. He even mentioned that the old man, as he affectionately called him, had scored an impressive 600 points back in the day. Charlie laughed, though he quietly told Leo that those old stories were better left in the past and shouldn't be brought up now. Wishing him a happy birthday, Charlie handed over the red envelope he had prepared earlier as a token of his well wishes. Leo's fingers pressed lightly against the envelope as he waved his hand, telling Charlie he was being far too formal and professional. He explained that they had invited him to enjoy himself, not to bring gifts or worry about such traditional formalities. Since they hadn't seen each other in 6 months, the goal was simply to reconnect and catch up on their lives. He insisted they start eating first, promising they would have plenty of time to talk and share a few drinks together. Leo then glanced at Lisa and asked if she was Charlie's sister. Lisa didn't show any offense, simply offering a small, amused smile. She introduced herself simply as Miss Lisa, while Leo introduced himself in return, clearly eager to make a good impression. He mentioned his role as a business manager at the university, presenting himself as a successful peer to his old friend Charlie. When Leo spoke about his career and his school, his voice rose with a noticeable sense of pride, which, naturally, he wanted everyone to hear. Another young man at the table chimed in, encouraging everyone to focus on the meal and start eating while the food was hot. As the atmosphere grew more relaxed, Leo pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered one to Charlie. He remarked that if Charlie had stayed in school instead of staying home, he would likely be working on advanced professional projects by now. A girl sitting nearby overheard the conversation and asked in a somewhat skeptical tone if Charlie was really involved in that kind of work. She seemed to be referencing things she had seen online, perhaps confusing his situation with some common internet tropes about food and lifestyle. Another man at the table wondered aloud if it was true, though he spoke politely, as if trying not to cause any further awkwardness. It was a strange coincidence, but in that moment, the conversation shifted toward the realities of their different paths in life. Our story continues as the conversation shifts toward the topic of a recent trip to the riverside dunes. One of the girls turned her gaze toward Lisa and asked, with a hint of curiosity, if she also spent her days at home preparing food. Lisa simply smiled and explained that she and Charlie were colleagues who worked together, though the girl seemed convinced it was a life of endless, repetitive chores. She remarked that working in the sun and wind must be difficult, yet marveled at how Lisa kept her skin so perfect, a compliment Lisa met with a quiet, knowing smile. She chose not to explain herself to these girls who hadn't seen much of the world, while Leo watched, feeling a strange surge of emotion at her grace. The group continued to dwell on the idea of a simple life spent at home, unable to imagine anything beyond their own narrow perspective. The girl suggested that with better choices, one wouldn't be stuck just distributing food, wondering aloud what else someone in that position could possibly achieve. Lisa, who had been mostly quiet, finally spoke up, gently noting that one should never judge people they don't truly know, as their assumptions rarely hold the full truth. The girl let out a dismissive whistle and continued her critique until Leo finally stepped in, telling Sarah to mind her words and stop being so disrespectful. We then learn the weight Charlie carries. His father has been bedridden for years, and his mother has spent her life as a dedicated caretaker. At this point, the entire future of the family rests solely on his shoulders as he struggles to move them all forward. Sarah, undeterred, commented on how the bright colors of the cups seemed to highlight the rough texture of their hands in the light. Suddenly, there was a shift in the air, a moment of unexpected softness as a hand rested gently on a shoulder. Turning around, we see Lisa looking directly at Charlie, her expression unreadable but steady. There was a certain sweetness in her gaze before Sarah broke the moment, asking Leo if he had sent out the schedule for last week's courses yet. She mentioned she had already received a notification on her phone and was curious to see what he had been sent. Leo pulled out his phone, and for a moment, a sense of quiet anticipation settled over the table like a strange miracle. He looked at Sarah and admitted that he was starting to feel a bit of the pressure and excitement of the upcoming work. He pointed out that the official notification for the course had actually been released just this afternoon. He confirmed he would be heading out first thing tomorrow morning, and with a final nod, the matter was settled. Our story continues as we see Lisa happily embracing Sarah, her joy practically radiating from the screen. She exclaimed that she had been waiting for this for a long time, fully expecting that this hotel would finally accept them. A woman sitting nearby watched them with a curious smile and asked what had gotten into the two of them. She wondered why they were so incredibly happy, to which Lisa replied that they simply couldn't contain their excitement. She explained that she and Sarah had applied together, and now their favorite hotel had invited them to a training course starting tomorrow. The group began to offer their congratulations, sharing in the moment of celebration as they all toasted to the news. It is always a good thing to have a high level of education, as it allows one to choose the exact career path they desire. Sarah had already turned down so many great companies, so the pressure was now on Lisa to work just as hard. A little later, the scene shifts as the group prepares to head over to a nearby cafe for the second part of their evening. The cafe was located about 2 kilometers away, just a short trip to keep the night going. As we watch them head down the restaurant stairs, their student friends take the lead, walking ahead of the rest. Charlie and Lisa found themselves walking at the back of the pack, where Charlie noted that they had already finished their meal. He told her she had already fulfilled her promise to come, so she shouldn't worry about him and was free to leave. He thanked her for keeping her word, but Lisa leaned in and whispered, asking if he really wasn't going to join the others for the second half. He declined, feeling that staying would only lead to more misunderstandings that they would eventually have to dig themselves out of. He felt he had nothing in common with the others, but Lisa paused, asking him exactly where he thought he was going. She offered to drive him, but by the time they reached the restaurant entrance, Sarah had already pulled up with 3 cars. The first car was already crowded, with 4 people squeezed inside and ready to go. In the second car, there were only 2 people, leaving quite a bit of empty space for the rest of the group. Deep down, he knew the lies and pretenses had to end here, especially after seeing the interview footage that made everything so much clearer. Charlie suggested that pairing Leo and Sarah would be the most suitable choice, or so he thought, while still trying to navigate the awkwardness of the situation. Lisa asked in a dissatisfied tone what he planned to do next, reminding him that she had only asked him to join her for dinner, a meal he clearly didn't enjoy. She had stayed with him until the very end despite facing various rejections, all because she believed he would eventually do the right thing. He knew she only wanted to help, and he truly appreciated her generosity, but things had changed significantly and were now starting to hurt his friends. Lisa argued that he had the choice not to cause harm, especially since he was the one in contact with both Leo and the management team. It seemed as though he was playing a game with himself, and on the other end of the line, Lisa sounded either genuinely angry or perhaps just testing him. He felt as though he were under fire simply for having a bad meal, but she told him to come to her office the next morning to handle the calls privately. She instructed him to notify the 2 candidates to come to the office to sign their contracts and start working, fulfilling the promise he had made. Otherwise, she suggested, it might be better if he didn't do anything at all. Lisa told him to call if he had any doubts, noting that even if he told Leo and the others he wasn't the department head, they wouldn't believe him anyway. And to be perfectly honest, she was probably right about that. He looked at Lisa and asked if her original plan wasn't to help him gain confidence, but rather to trap him in this difficult situation. Lisa's expression shifted to one of slight distress as she stood up from the sofa, telling him he could think whatever he liked before walking away. Since things had come to this, he decided there was no use worrying, so he picked up the phone and dialed the bank's internal line directly. He informed the assistant that Lisa was hired and should come in this weekend to sign, but the assistant then asked who the second hire would be. He felt the phone vibrating in his palm, while Lisa's gaze remained fixed on him, never wavering as the assistant waited for an answer. The assistant asked again who the second person should be, and though Lisa's name was on the tip of his tongue, he found he couldn't say it. The assistant confirmed they could hear him, and finally, he spoke Sarah's name, a choice that, strangely enough, brought him a sense of relief. He realized his back was drenched in sweat, but he pushed forward, arranging for the final details to be settled by Saturday. After hanging up, he lay back on the sofa and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Lisa's receding footsteps in the quiet room. She sat on the sofa and looked at him, thanking him while explaining that this had all been a test, a revelation that left Charlie with a rather forced, awkward smile. He told her not to try and comfort him with talk of tests or impractical experiments, his mind drifting back to the events of a few days prior. Lisa insisted that in the real world, there isn't much room for what-ifs, and she wasn't worried about the small deceptions he had maintained until now. In fact, she admitted she was glad he lied, as it gave them more chances to connect, though she offered a sincere apology for putting him through such a difficult trial. Before Lisa could even finish her thought, the phone rang. It was Leo, and as Charlie answered, he heard the man's voice on the other end calling out to him. With Lisa sitting right there, Charlie couldn't explain much, simply telling Leo he would call him back later, hoping, of course, to handle the next steps more privately. As he dealt with these calls, his demeanor grew heavier, while Lisa continued her apology, promising to explain exactly what she had done to earn his recognition. She expressed her gratitude for everything he had done that day, even as he looked at her with a mix of frustration and a lingering sense of guilt. She acknowledged the massive problem she'd dropped in his lap, explaining that the company was currently restructuring many of its departments due to recent internal issues. She wanted friends by her side who would stand firm as she organized her own team, which is why she had asked for his help with the interviews the day before. Her original intent was simply to show off a bit of excellence in front of his friends, believing that if he had just contacted Leo and Sarah, none of this tension would have happened. The company only intended to add one person before the upcoming month of retirements, and she watched his expression closely to see if he wanted her to continue. She had been observing him during the interviews and was surprised he hadn't announced a collaboration with Sarah right then and there before returning to the office. When he told her Sarah wasn't the right fit, she secretly agreed, though they didn't need to discuss the specific reasons why that partnership fell off. A sudden thought had struck her. She had to let him finish the process to see his final choice, and in the end, he didn't surprise her. He stuck to the right decision. She knew the choice was difficult and might have caused some friction, and she found herself wondering if he had ultimately stood his ground just for her sake. A faint, knowing smile touched his lips as he told her not to overthink it. He simply had his own principles to follow and didn't want to betray his own judgment. Lisa happily remarked that she needed someone exactly like him, but when she tried to steer the conversation, he simply reached for a bottle of wine instead. He told her quite bluntly that he wasn't her employee right now and would drink if he pleased, noting that she shouldn't limit his freedom even if he were on the clock. Lisa didn't seem to mind, recalling how he had also been drinking in her office the day before, noting that alcohol seemed to sharpen his thoughts during this corporate transition. Lisa began asking which department he'd prefer, what his interests were, and what his previous experience involved, even curious about his recipes and his habit of eating on the job. He told her he was being perfectly honest and that she shouldn't joke, reminding her that he was just a regular worker who had spent his time stuck in the kitchen. He insisted that he had only ever done entry-level work, but if she truly wanted to offer him a real opportunity, she should just say so. Lisa simply encouraged him to continue. She promised him a satisfying salary that wouldn't be lower than his current one, explaining that while a typical staff member earns $6,000 or $7,000, she had more in mind. When he suggested $8,000 to be a security guard, Lisa's expression became utterly unreadable. She stared at him for a long time before asking if he was actually serious. He asked if the security role included free meals and housing, as well as a solid performance bonus and a predictable schedule he could prepare for. He wanted to know exactly how much time he'd have for rest, thinking he could read more books during his breaks. To him, being a weekend security guard sounded like a dream. She agreed to let him handle the security work, noting the company provides food and a room, though she warned him the living quarters consisted of a simple shared bunk. She wasn't entirely sure how the shifts were structured, as that was usually handled by lower management, but she promised he would still have time to rest. As she spoke, Lisa checked her watch and suggested they grab lunch together, though she first had to ask if he was inviting her or if she was treating him. The conversation clearly lightened Lisa's mood, and before long, she had already arranged for a security uniform to be sent over to him. She told him to wear the uniform this weekend and report to the head of security to finalize his position. Charlie even double-checked if the $8,000 salary was real. Lisa calmly confirmed the amount, and later, when he returned home, he laid out the security uniform on his bed, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. He felt surprisingly energized looking at it, but his thoughts were interrupted when Leo called again. Afterward, he checked in with Lisa's assistant to confirm the details. The assistant understood the plan perfectly, and by 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, Charlie was in uniform and heading out to meet Sarah. When they met, she looked him up and down and even congratulated him on how sharp he looked, though he jokingly called her a fool for the compliment. He remarked that if he were in charge, he'd make all security uniforms look like tactical military gear, a thought that made Sarah laugh as they walked. She told him she needed to change into her own work clothes first, leading him to the second floor where she walked straight into the vice president's office. The person inside didn't even look up at first, and for a moment, it felt like they were being ignored. Sarah told him to stay calm and not to worry about the professor. The woman inside looked up in a panic, quickly hiding her phone, as Sarah introduced Charlie as the new colleague who would be working alongside the professor. After that, we see him getting settled as Sarah helped him secure his own office, a spacious, empty room he never could have imagined having just a few days ago when he was still a delivery man. Today, he finally had his own independent workspace, and as Sarah handed him the keys, she told him the security department was now in his hands and to contact her directly if things got difficult. In a little while, Professor Kyle would be sending over some documents, as this role involved many small tasks that required hard work to honor the trust Lisa had placed in him. She wished him a successful first day, but not long after, before he even had a chance to sit down, the doorbell rang and a security guard appeared at the door with a very serious tone. It seemed a guest outside was causing trouble and they needed him to resolve it, though he wondered to himself if the service staff shouldn't be the ones handling guest complaints. However, if a problem occurred with a guest at the Descartes Hotel, the security team had to take charge, especially since the other security managers were unwilling to step up. They had blocked the entrance with their vehicles while Professor Kyle waited there, specifically asking for our protagonist to come and provide a solution to the standoff. He suddenly discovered that a car was blocking the exit. The owner claimed his vehicle had been damaged, and the real problem was the lack of surveillance footage in that area. The cameras covering that specific spot were broken, but Mr. Lewis pointed out that as the new head of security, Charlie shouldn't worry and would surely provide a fair explanation. The car owner looked at him with genuine surprise, asking if he was truly the one in charge of the situation. He demanded an explanation immediately, wanting to know exactly how the hotel intended to compensate him for the damage. Imagine the scene. He had only been on the job for an hour when he faced this firestorm, but just as he was being pressured, a beautiful woman appeared and claimed she did it. She explained she had confused the car with her ex-husband's, and just like that, his first major crisis was solved, leaving Mr. Lewis staring at him in complete disbelief. Later, we returned to the office where the company president, Mike, was meeting with Mr. Lewis and the surveillance team. Mike noted, quite casually, that the issue had been settled. It turned out Mr. Lewis hadn't been able to solve it himself, so Charlie had stepped in to find someone to take responsibility, asking his brother if there was any further issue. Mike immediately laughed and said there was no problem at all, though he noted that personnel transitions should usually be decided by the oversight committee, shouldn't they? Lisa replied, quite strictly, asking if the committee's approval was really necessary for every single choice made within the departments. She told them not to worry, as the board meeting wasn't far off and these official appointments would be finalized then. She asked Charlie what he thought, while Kyle looked at Mike in surprise. Kyle encouraged Charlie to speak, but the man quickly cut in to address the current situation. He suggested that since the new head wasn't yet familiar with the company's inner workings, he would need old Kyle's help and support, a point that Lisa acknowledged calmly. Mike agreed to follow her lead and give Kyle another chance. Afterward, as Lisa and Kyle left, Sarah appeared and looked at Charlie with calm, observant eyes. Later, we learned that Mike is actually Lisa's half-brother, and since the passing of their father, Lisa has been relying on Sarah's constant support to navigate the company. While Mike pretends to help, he is actually trying to undermine Lisa by replacing her people, hoping to make her leadership look weak as her own popularity grows. Lisa felt her position was becoming unstable, and that evening, Charlie returned home so exhausted that he practically collapsed in the bathroom and fell fast asleep until Jane woke him. He even ended up sharing her dinner. Ever since they resolved that misunderstanding over the stray dog, their relationship had been growing noticeably closer. Suddenly, a call from his old friend Mike, not the president, but his second brother, woke him up, inviting him to a bar for a drink to finally relax a little. He invited Jane along just in case, and to his surprise, she accepted. Soon, Mike led them into a bar where 3 men and a woman, all in their 30s, were waiting. The woman had a striking presence, and as Mike introduced Charlie to the group as his brother, Charlie raised his glass to greet the 3 men and the lady, known as Sister Val. Val looked at Mike and then at Jane, jokingly calling Mike trash and asking who this other brother was, since Mike had promised to bring someone interesting. Charlie wasn't about to let them tease him that easily, so he settled in for a few more drinks. The group laughed, and Jane told Mike that his friend was actually quite clever. She noted that Charlie was much more fun than Mike, offering to share a drink with him. We see that these men were actually trainees Mike had been mentoring. They were all enjoying themselves, though they weren't exactly heavy drinkers, and just as they were chatting happily, Jane suddenly stepped forward and took a glass herself. She downed it in one go and told Mike that she had finished the task he asked of her, leaving Charlie feeling quite surprised by the sudden change in atmosphere. Jane took another glass and offered an apology to Charlie, saying that their rough start had led to this friendship, and she drank to him, telling him to drink as he pleased. After saying this, she finished her drink. Charlie looked at Mike, who was smiling as his colleagues began to follow Jane's lead and show Charlie some respect. It seemed she had never truly appreciated anyone before this moment, but Charlie was starting to earn his place in her eyes. After finishing his third drink, Charlie grew curious and asked Mike which department he actually worked in within the larger organization. Mike shook his head, explaining he didn't like working at the Descartes Hotel and his sister wouldn't let him anyway, which made Charlie wonder if his sister was a manager there. Mike smiled, telling him not to worry. He explained that he hadn't accomplished much since graduating, but he had learned a lot about the world while looking after his mother. He revealed that before his mother passed, she told him and his sister that their father was actually the late Mr. Descartes, who had supported them until his unexpected death earlier this year. We learned that the late Mr. Descartes split his estate into 3 parts, one for Lisa, one for her sister, and one for his half-brother, Mike, though he named Lisa president and asked Mike to help her. However, after just 1 week, Mike realized the corporate environment was far from friendly. He found himself being pressured to become the person who would help others undermine his own sister. He refused, of course, and as he spoke, he became more emotional, raising a beer to ask Charlie if he thought he was completely useless. Charlie simply clinked his glass and told him not to think that way. Charlie noted that Mike simply couldn't stomach an innocent war, which proved he had a genuine personality. As a friend, Charlie preferred teaching him, as he valued loyalty above all else. Mike felt a sting of emotion in his chest as they bonded, telling Charlie not to hesitate if he ever needed anything, joking that if he were a more complicated man, he'd be a healthy son to him. After a few more drinks, Charlie mentioned that Lisa had already made arrangements for him to work in the security department as a protector for the company's operations. Mike felt his sister was being too inconsiderate and offered to tell her that night to change Charlie's department, giving him his choice of any position within the vast hotel. Charlie took a small sip of his drink and declined, explaining that he couldn't do everything and preferred starting from the bottom. Besides, he and Lisa were already on quite good terms. He was perfectly satisfied with her making him the head of the security department. Mike let out a dry laugh, admitting that on Charlie's first day, things had already been quite intense. Someone had already tried to give him a hard time, and the others were watching closely to see how he'd react. Charlie admitted that being intimidated by the guards had been a painful experience. When the quietest man in the group asked what happened, Charlie explained the day's events, concluding that one shouldn't resort to hitting people the very first time a problem arises. He posed a simple question to the group. Did they really believe these sorts of professional issues could be solved through violence? He wanted to work hard and treat it as a challenge, feeling that if he couldn't manage this small task, he'd be failing himself. Val felt his sincerity and promised the sisters would support him. To survive in an environment where you can't just eliminate every problem, Charlie knew he had to stay ahead of the schedule, especially with the upcoming events at the hotel. He told himself this was just the practice required to live a good, kind life, even if it meant dealing with these heavy-handed types who needed a bit of guidance. He prepared himself for the upcoming operations, realizing that his mindset was his strongest asset in this corporate jungle. He believed that his mental state was more important than physical resistance, and he decided to give his detractors a chance to fail on their own. That night, he finally drifted off into a deep sleep. He had been tracking his plan so intensely that he couldn't sleep until 2 in the morning. At dawn, he sent a message to Lisa, hoping for her continued support. He waited for a reply that didn't come until he arrived at the company, where he suddenly felt a wave of nerves, though he knew there was no turning back now. After a simple meeting, things went exactly as expected. Not everyone was willing to cooperate with Lisa's discussion, especially after that video of the young man began to circulate. We see that security was notified immediately, leading to a major struggle between Lisa and the opposition. Soon after, people from various departments came looking for Charlie, as Mike refused to accept the guard's retirement. Fortunately, Lisa appeared at just the right moment. She informed the HR staff that Mike was demanding the leadership take a stand against the current security protocols. The HR personnel felt the weight of the situation as they prepared to meet with the higher-ups. After Charlie returned, he told the president that once Mike left, Lisa simply smiled. She noted that this wasn't just about a simple retirement, but a competition of effort. Charlie took a deep breath, realizing that being a hidden player is much like taking on a secret mission. Moving too fast might cause resentment, but Lisa made it clear she supported him. Suddenly, her phone rang, and she answered with a focused expression. After a few brief words, she hung up and announced the situation was under control. The president wanted to use this chance to embarrass her, and now they were asking Charlie to be ready. Charlie asked Lisa if he had caused her more trouble, wondering what she needed him to do. She explained that Mike was unhappy because Charlie should have been assigned his tasks long ago. Mike was seizing the opportunity to join the president's board meeting to file a formal complaint against Lisa. The meeting was scheduled for 2:30. She told him he had to be there in his own way, even if he felt a bit nervous. After all, shareholders only care about the company's profit. He only needed to win over the majority, and Lisa assured him everything would be fine. She warned that Mike would use this chance to try and select a new leader. Lisa couldn't afford to lose control of the company's operations. Charlie took another deep breath, telling himself he was now ready to wait for his moment, whenever it might come. After Lisa left, Charlie headed to Falcon Street to buy a proper suit. He chose a sharp, lightweight style that cost over $1,000, giving him the look of a special forces officer. He wore it to the boardroom at table 29, where an executive immediately questioned Lisa, doubting whether someone so young could truly be reliable. Another executive suggested there must be a reason for the delay, noting that since the board requested this meeting, they should listen to what Charlie had to say. Mike then asked a pointed question. He claimed that by the second day, the veteran staff were being pushed aside and that Lisa's management had flaws. He even accused her of greed, expressing concern for the company's future. He wanted to discuss the company's development and the selection of a president. His intentions couldn't be clearer, and he finished speaking just as Lisa prepared to counter him. One executive stated he would only support whoever could make the investment profitable. Another added that the company didn't belong solely to the Descartes family. They respected the legacy of the former president, but insisted on supporting competence, whether it was Lisa, Mike, or anyone else who could lead them effectively. Lisa spoke up, stating she held the presidency because of the recent criticisms. She then invited Charlie, using his full name, Charlie, to share his thoughts with the room. Charlie walked into Lisa's space and looked out at the gathered faces. Earlier that day, he had bought a new phone, and now he was ready to show them exactly what he had captured. Charlie explained that his interest wasn't just in the marriage, but in the 10 years he spent waiting for relief at Atlantic 75. He told them this wasn't just business, it was personal. As soon as he finished speaking, an elderly gentleman was the first to start clapping in approval. Lisa followed his lead, and soon the rest of the room joined in with a round of applause. Then, Charlie addressed the group one last time, offering a sincere apology before concluding his presentation. After that, he stepped out of the boardroom and made his way back to the quiet of the office. Upon arriving, we see that he found 6 or 7 application forms scattered across the floor. It seemed every security chief in the building was now vying to become a captain under his lead. He looked up just as Lisa walked in, her expression a mix of excitement and disbelief at what had just transpired. She asked him how he was feeling after the intensity of today's presidential board meeting. He assured her he was fine, especially since everyone now supported his vision for the security department. However, she noted they had only granted him a 1-month trial period, leaving the ultimate success entirely in his hands. In a low voice, Charlie thanked her for giving him this chance to prove his worth. He jokingly promised that if she provided the resources, he would ensure nothing ever went missing under his watch. At this, Lisa simply rolled her eyes, though a small smile played on her lips. She stayed in the office for about 10 minutes, chatting briefly about the next steps before finally taking her leave. Charlie reflected on the new responsibilities ahead. His heart was full of passion, yet he knew the road wouldn't be easy. When he returned home later that evening, his uncle called to ask how the day's events had unfolded. His uncle advised him to act quickly to neutralize the influence of the rival faction, Kevin's group. The plan was simple: turn the 3 captains into his own loyal allies as soon as possible. By giving them enough authority, they could effectively compete with and eventually overtake Kevin's influence. Charlie admitted that while he was new to the role, he wasn't exactly familiar with the current power dynamics. The goal was to empower the captains, making them value their positions more than ever before. Lisa's earlier words had left him deep in thought, and that night, he stayed up designing a new management plan. The following afternoon at the office, we see him carefully selecting 3 new captains for the team. One of the men he chose was a veteran named Edward. He was a former soldier, and Charlie felt quite satisfied with his disciplined background. Later that afternoon, he called for a general assembly to address the entire security staff. With everyone gathered, he officially announced the names of the 3 new captains. He looked directly at Kevin and declared that these captains would have absolute authority over their squads. However, he added a twist: any mistake made by a captain would result in a double penalty. Kevin immediately voiced his opposition to this new policy, but Lisa cut him off, asking if he truly understood her authority. She then turned to Charlie, questioning why he hadn't consulted her on such a major decision first. At that moment, every security guard in the room had their eyes fixed squarely on Charlie. He simply offered a faint, calm smile in response to the tension. She reminded him that as the president, she should have been the first person he approached. Charlie then told the staff that if they faced any issues in work or life, they could go directly to their captains or the president. And if those leaders couldn't solve the problem, the captains were encouraged to bring the matter to him. With that final instruction, he declared the meeting officially over. We see Kevin's face turn a pale shade of green before Charlie headed off to see the accountant, Sarah, to request funds for new uniforms. She informed him that the department would indeed need a continued budget to cover those expenses. Once the request was approved, Charlie planned to head over to Wofen Street. He told himself that next time the costs would be higher, and he'd have to give them more guidance. We see him open his bag, where a wallet stuffed with $100 bills was tucked away. Deep down, he felt a flicker of anxiety, knowing his father needed money for his weekly payments. In the past, he used to wake up early and work until the late hours of the night. He hadn't expected making money to be this easy, but his heart was still heavy with the effort. A voice inside told him he needed the cash, yet he didn't want to simply accept it. After hearing Lisa say he might be resented, he worried and considered handing the money to the finance department. To be honest, the value of earning respect was worth far more than those $100,000. Just as he was about to head out, the captain called a group of men together. They gathered in the open space behind the hotel, ready to begin their very first training session. Charlie had promised to join, so he packed his things, changed into his gear, and hurried out. He spent the next half-hour training alongside them with full intensity. Afterward, he dragged his exhausted body back to the quiet of the office. He turned off a light, but the moment he opened the door, he felt a strange sense of unease. When he checked his bag, he realized with a shock that the wallet and the money had vanished. He searched both bags again, but there wasn't a single trace of his credit cards or cash left. The lock on the office door wasn't broken, though there was a security wire visible on the outside. The only possibility, it seemed, was that someone else had a key to the office. He reviewed the training footage, but everyone had been accounted for during that half hour by the security cameras. A few months ago, 6 or 7 people were present during that half hour, and they were all deeply worried. It was then that Lisa sent him a video message through the app. When he opened it, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine, making his hair stand on end. The video showed everything, capturing the movements of the executive department's president and the entire staff. He was so shaken that he could barely even process the words on the screen. He was completely lost, but what surprised him even more was the follow-up call from Lisa. She told him quite bluntly that he had gone far too over the line this time. He had only been in the position for 3 days, and yet, he was already caught taking payments. She asked him if he couldn't have been more discreet, even if he did intend to take the money. He had been caught like a fly in a trap. The video of him taking the cash was already circulating through every department. She demanded to know what he was thinking and if he had any possible explanation for his actions. The phone felt heavy in his hand as he began to explain himself with desperate speed. He told himself that his true intention had always been to hand that money over to the administration. Lisa simply laughed, asking him if he honestly expected her to believe such a convenient misunderstanding. Suddenly, he realized just how foolish his explanations sounded to anyone else's ears. If he were in her shoes, he wouldn't believe a man who had cash in his car only to claim he meant to report it. The voice on the phone grew heated, and after seeing the video in the work group, the reality of the situation finally hit him. Back in the office, a wave of discomfort washed over him. He lit a cigarette, feeling too drained to say another word. The president of the executive department then entered the room and directly informed him of his termination. And so, we find him left to ponder how he would ever take responsibility for the mess he had made. Getting fired on his third day and claiming he'd take responsibility for everything. It was, in hindsight, an utterly foolish thing to say. Later, we find him sitting on a ledge in a quiet spot, nursing a beer and trying to drown his regrets in drink. Lisa appeared behind him then, quietly taking a seat by his side as the evening air settled around them. He asked if she was there for the money, but she simply shook her head, admitting the pressure of work had been weighing on her. She began to reminisce about her old life with her mother in the city and how they used to wander those streets together. Today, those memories felt heavy. He looked at her, wondering if he had become her greatest disappointment. Staring into the distance, he repeated his claim that he had intended to turn the money over to the finance department. He asked if she believed him, though he couldn't help but let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. After all, who would believe him now? He then asked if she had received the official notice from the company. Lisa asked him about it privately while he continued to drink, the weight of the situation hanging between them. He mentioned that he knew Kevin had been secretly taking photos and hiding evidence as well. She casually replied that she knew about the $10,000 he had taken for himself, too. She was well aware of the situation, noting that the money had already been transferred to the legal authorities. He laughed nervously, wondering aloud if they were going to have him arrested and treated like a common fugitive. Lisa tried to offer some comfort, and in that moment, he felt like she was the only one who truly understood. She told him he should keep trying, though deep down, he felt like he was only lying to himself about his future. The thought of being arrested played over and over in his mind like a broken record, haunting his every thought. So many things pointed toward his downfall, yet a small part of him wondered if there was still a way to change his path. It was a moment of strange, quiet reflection, almost romantic in its own tragic way, if one were inclined to see it that way. He felt overwhelmed. He realized he hadn't even properly introduced himself yet, wondering why she was being so kind to him. Suddenly, Ryan felt an overwhelming urge to flee the city, though he had no idea where to go. As he wandered, a little girl of about 6 or 7 approached him, looking remarkably sweet and innocent. He bought some flowers from her and struck up a conversation, soon meeting her grandmother. Through them, we learn about the rest of their family and the struggles they've endured. The grandmother explained that her daughter and son had worked in the city for years before simply vanishing. Now, she and little Nina were left alone, desperately searching for them. 3 years had passed, and for a long time, they slept on the streets. Eventually, a kind homeowner took them in to watch over a property, giving them a safe place to live. They survived by selling flowers, and despite everything, the little girl remained bright. As we watched them talk late into the night, Ryan realized his own outlook was far more negative than theirs. Compared to their hardships, his own frustrations seemed small, almost trivial, to be honest. He gave them his contact information, offering to help with anything they might need before heading home. Back at the apartment, Lisa sat on the bed, looking defeated. She couldn't accept the situation, so Ryan showed her a photo of little Nina to shift her perspective. As he told her the girl's story, Lisa was moved and immediately wanted to help. Just then, her phone rang. It was a friend named Sarah, asking where Ryan was and telling him to come to the Golden Sun Club. Sarah mentioned that Ryan's older brother, Mike, was already there with her. When Ryan arrived at the lounge, he found Mike sitting at the bar, nursing a drink and looking tense. The club was filled with the low hum of late-night chatter. Mike pulled him into a private room and demanded to know why he hadn't mentioned being scammed, reminding him that family is there to help. Ryan didn't dare reply, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over him. Sarah stepped in then, trying to ease the tension by explaining that Ryan simply hadn't wanted to cause any trouble. Mike stopped his pacing and made a quick call, and a moment later, a man entered the room. Sarah told Mike not to be too hard on him, as no one had expected things to go this far. The man apologized with a nervous smile. Ryan recognized him as a prominent merchant from the local district, who immediately addressed him with great respect as Director Ryan. The merchant expressed his deep regret over the $100,000 and the trouble it caused. Mike, however, remained calm, noting that the only thing that mattered now was the plan. The man produced a USB drive and placed it on the table, explaining that all the social media posts and video evidence were ready. Sarah then pulled out a phone to begin the review. He watched the contents of the drive with growing excitement. By the end, he was completely stunned. He hadn't realized such a thorough countermove was even possible. The first file on the drive was a 2-minute video. In it, the merchant spoke directly to the camera, explaining how someone had recently taught him how to use a new messaging app. He revealed that he had been pressured to send $100,000 to Ryan's account, under the threat that his goods would be returned if he didn't comply. He had followed the instructions, only to realize later that he'd been used in a scam. After he was blocked on the app, he decided to record everything as proof of the deception. The screen then showed a recording of the chat logs, ending with the image of a blocked contact. Sarah noted that the account used in the video belonged to none other than Kevin. We see that the videos and screen captures were all designed to identify the culprit. Mike told Ryan he could return to the DK company whenever he liked, as Kevin wouldn't be able to talk his way out of this one. Ryan acknowledged that his brother's methods were impressive, but he had simply lost interest in that world. He asked them to forget it and not even post the evidence, as he had no desire to return to the corporate life. To be honest, that environment of constant misunderstandings and power struggles just didn't suit his personality. He felt that anyone could find work elsewhere, so there was no reason to be afraid, even after being scammed. Sarah cut in, asking if he really thought society would just overlook someone who appeared weak. She reminded him that as a member of the family, he had to stand back up exactly where he had fallen. Ryan, however, wasn't looking for bold success. He just wanted the quiet life of an ordinary citizen. This clearly frustrated Sarah, who playfully swiped at him with her handbag in a fit of pique. The others quickly stepped in to settle the tension. Mike told Ryan to stop talking since he was clearly upsetting Sarah, then suggested they all head out for lunch to clear the air. Since Ryan hadn't eaten yet, they decided to move quickly. Lisa praised his resolve as Mike and Sarah led the way to a small, quiet restaurant nearby. Lunch was a quiet affair, but Mike eventually asked if Ryan truly intended to never return to the company. Ryan gave a direct answer. He didn't care about the position anymore. Mike then turned his attention to Lisa. He mentioned that all the evidence for the trial was ready and asked Ryan what he was so afraid of. Ryan explained it wasn't fear, but a genuine dislike for that toxic environment. He asked Mike if he would really be willing to let their family name be slandered like this. Mike pointed out that Lisa had always looked out for him, and that his current situation was quite serious. After all, who would believe he intended to return that $100,000 once it hit his account? He added that while Lisa didn't care about the money, Ryan hadn't even tried to understand her perspective. This realization caught Ryan completely off guard. He hadn't considered it from that angle at all. Lisa was deeply hurt because the company was facing pressure from shareholders, and she desperately needed someone she could actually trust. Mike continued to lay out the reality of the situation. He urged Ryan to think it over, hoping he would stay reachable. Kevin needed to be dealt with as he was a direct threat to Lisa's position, but Ryan only promised to think about it for a few days. That afternoon, we see Ryan and Lisa taking the printed photos of little Nina and her grandmother back to the district. They found the pair and began discussing a plan to help them. They realized that giving money was only a temporary fix. The real goal was to help the family reunite. Lisa knelt down to show Nina a photo, speaking to her gently. They planned to buy all her flowers that night so the girl could rest, telling her the flowers were now free for others. All they asked was for people to take a photo of the girl and post it on social media. Imagine the scene, a small girl sitting hopefully while strangers help spread her story. After a full night of effort, the results of their campaign were starting to show. Kind-hearted strangers began spontaneously sharing videos of Nina and her grandmother across various platforms. The story was finally starting to go viral online. Many people even wanted to donate money, but since the grandmother didn't have a smartphone, Lisa collected over $3,000 in her name to pass along to them later. After handing the money to the grandmother, we hoped Nina would finally reunite with her parents, but unfortunately, a piece of bad news broke across public media today. A malicious article was published claiming Lisa had compensated the family only to steal from them later, accusing her of pocketing the donations in her own name. The video clearly showed her face while Ryan stood beside her as a blurred figure. Suddenly, she became the target of public outrage both online and off. Her identity and workplace were leaked, leaving Ryan to shield her as she grabbed his hand, trembling, and asked what kind of world they were living in. She wondered why it was so difficult to simply do something kind without it being twisted into something ugly. Ryan tried his best to comfort her, suggesting they go check on Nina and her grandmother, though deep down he knew this scandal wouldn't just disappear. Before they could even set out, the pressure became too much and Lisa broke down in tears, admitting she was exhausted and just wanted to go home. In the end, they didn't go to the district. Instead, they both turned off their phones, hoping to disappear from the world for just a little while. They tried various ways to clear her name, using documents and live streams to tell the truth, but strangely enough, nothing seemed to work. We see them sitting at a table in a heavy, restless silence, unsure of what move to make next. That day, a swarm of tabloid journalists and cameramen descended upon them, looking for a scandal to exploit. After a series of aggressive interviews, Lisa and Ryan finally agreed to speak, hoping that explaining the truth would help the situation. However, an even greater heartbreak awaited them when a public account posted a truly unacceptable video later that afternoon. In the footage, the audience could see their faces and their lips moving, but the original audio had been completely stripped away. To be perfectly honest, the way the dialogue was dubbed over was nothing short of a calculated character assassination. The fake subtitles claimed that Ryan and Lisa were admitting to scamming the public and manipulating Nina's story for profit. The video made it look as though they were confessing to exploiting the fact that the elderly grandmother didn't understand technology. It depicted them as villains who had intentionally used their own QR codes to intercept the donations meant for the child. By the end of the edited clip, the two of them appeared to be bowing and apologizing to society for their supposed greed. They were shown begging for forgiveness, while a second post even more disgustingly claimed they didn't know the grandmother or Nina at all. In the original footage, they were simply looking into the camera and saying thank you over and over again. Lisa had told Ryan that seeing the grandmother and Nina through the screen truly made her feel happy. They were expressing their gratitude from the bottom of their hearts, pure and simple. To Ryan, these two videos were a clear and calculated response designed to provoke a reaction. This latest post set the internet ablaze, stirring up public emotion and leading to even more malicious leaks. But this time, the narrative claimed that Lisa and Ryan were actually hiding the grandmother and Nina away. The accusation was that they, were using their tragic story for personal financial gain. This public account was incredibly influential, broadcasting these lies to over 30,000 followers in a single livestream. Within just 1 hour, the message count hit 100,000, and the post had been shared just as many times. The comments that followed were even more ridiculous, filled with baseless hate and blind judgment. Lisa's tears wouldn't stop falling as she turned to Ryan and asked him a single, heartbreaking question. Ryan held her tightly, trying to comfort her by whispering that if they just waited a little longer, everything would improve. Lisa whispered back that she was just so tired and only wanted to sleep for a while. We see Ryan watching over her as she finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep. She looked so lonely. Meanwhile, a friend named Kevin called to say his uncle was already helping to investigate the source. It turned out this public smear campaign was being orchestrated by someone named Miller to stir up a massive controversy. The claim was that Lisa's every action had been a stunt to increase her own popularity. But no one expected that Lisa would choose the simplest, most tragic way to respond to the pressure. She decided on a definitive method to bring all of her suffering to a permanent end. By the time the police arrived at the scene, Ryan was rushing toward her room, desperate to see her one last time. But the police had already placed her belongings into a small evidence bag. They also took Ryan to the interrogation room, treating him almost like a suspect under arrest. He told them everything he knew about Lisa's situation and exactly why she had reached this breaking point. Without anyone noticing the time slipping away, 2 hours had already passed. During those 2 hours, the officers seemed to soften, even offering him their own cigarettes to calm his nerves. As he spoke about Lisa's tragic end, they even handed him a bottle of water to help him through it. He recounted how Lisa stood on that building, saying she had been bitten by the world's cruelty until she could no longer speak. Even the police officers, hardened as they were, couldn't help but shed a few tears. He didn't want to be overly dramatic, but the weight of the truth was simply undeniable. He kept drinking the water they gave him, while a female officer silently wrote her name on a note for him. Looking at the officers, he declared that the company was the one truly responsible for Lisa's death. He begged them to take public responsibility and restore the innocent reputation of those who had been slandered. The female officer seemed deeply moved by his words, and after a moment, she took out her phone and showed it to him. She explained that she couldn't give him the original death certificate or official documents just yet. However, she allowed him to see a photo of it on her screen, which was a small but significant gesture. On that screen, we see the very last comment Lisa had posted before she went up to that rooftop. As Ryan read it, he realized that Lisa's family background was far more tragic than anyone had ever imagined. Her father had endured a terrifying past before leaving the family, and her mother had passed away long ago. By the age of 16, she had become a girl with no home and no family to lean on. After finishing the report, Ryan was consumed by a silent, burning anger, eventually collapsing onto the table in tears. He was so overwhelmed that he didn't even notice his phone slipping from his hand and hitting the floor. The female officer gently picked it up, promising him that she would definitely help track down the two company executives. She spoke of bringing back justice, but at that word, Ryan couldn't help but cry out in frustration. He asked her what justice could possibly mean now, or if such a thing even existed anymore. After all, when people are already gone, the word justice starts to sound a bit hollow, doesn't it? He demanded to know where they were before all this happened, but realizing his outburst, he quickly fell silent. Looking the officer in the eye, he told her he needed to see Lisa one last time and asked where she was. She told him to trust her, that he wouldn't want to see her like this, and should remember her as she was. Instead, she suggested they focus on the investigation, mentioning the mysterious car that had visited his home. She was determined to help him find those executives, and to be honest, she was his best hope. With her resources and the team at her disposal, we see that it wouldn't take long to find their trail. In the company records, they identified the man in charge as Zach, the same man who interviewed Lisa. It appeared this man had been moving through various corporate channels, constantly shifting his tracks. As they dug deeper into the channel's history, they discovered the true head of this entire operation. The legal representative was a woman named Tiffany, the very same person who had appeared on television recently. Ryan immediately recognized her face and remembered the cold, pointed questions she had asked before. A knot of suspicion tightened in his stomach, and he had to fight to keep his emotions under control. The police cross-referenced Lisa's case with the executive's movements, matching the names of those involved. They even managed to track the GPS signal of their vehicle, pinpointing its current location in real time. After checking the routes, Ryan coordinated with his uncle and a friend named Ian to assist with the search. We see that Ryan never imagined the officer, Amy, would take this case so personally or show such deep concern. She told him that Lisa was a hard-working woman who didn't deserve to fall into such a cruel, unfair trap. She was determined to find the truth, but as they drove, she warned him to stay calm regardless of who they found. They were in this together now, focused on assessing the situation and securing every piece of evidence they could find. Everything had to be done by the book, a level of discipline that, to be honest, completely surprised him. Half an hour later, they spotted Tiffany's luxury SUV, and Amy began looking for a spot to intercept the vehicle. As they kept a close watch on the car, Tiffany and Zach suddenly appeared in the distance. His first instinct, naturally, was to fixate on those two, the ones responsible for everything. He urgently told Amy to move the car and block them in, pointing out exactly where they were standing. Amy remained far calmer than he was, simply asking if he was ready to make the move right then and there. She steered the car directly forward, aiming to cut off the path of the luxury SUV's front bumper. Fearing they might escape, she didn't hesitate, driving straight toward the target with practiced precision. Suddenly, two blinding white headlights flared up directly in front of them, cutting through the dark. The glare was so intense that Ryan found it impossible to even keep his eyes open for a moment. Immediately after, the roar of an engine filled the air, followed by the screech of a sudden, violent brake. In the very next second, the sound of someone shouting echoed through the tense silence of the street. Then, those brilliant headlights swept past them as the other vehicle sped away into the night. The entire encounter lasted barely 10 seconds, and once the car was gone, their vision slowly returned to normal. To their dismay, they realized that Tiffany and Zach had completely vanished into the shadows. In that moment, both Amy and Ryan felt a profound sense of unease settle over them. Both of them were dead. Amy, acting with impressive speed, immediately threw the car into reverse. She wanted to chase the vehicle that had just sped past us, but we noticed she missed the other car's taillights. After we stepped out of the car, we saw two people lying on the ground after being struck. Tiffany had fallen onto the road, though she appeared to still be conscious of her surroundings. While we were discussing the situation, she began to whistle incessantly, a strange reaction, to say the least. Suddenly, a familiar voice echoed in Ryan's ears, causing both him and Amy to turn their heads at once. It was Lisa, appearing beside them along with a small group of people who had just arrived. She introduced herself to Amy as the CEO of dazed International, the head of their entire operation. She explained that she intended to take Tiffany back to the company to handle some urgent matters personally. Amy was quite surprised and told Lisa firmly that Tiffany was currently under arrest and must go to the station. The corners of Lisa's mouth curled upward, and the atmosphere between them grew noticeably tense. She calmly remarked that even someone under arrest could be removed from police custody if necessary. Then, she pointedly asked Amy who she was and what authority she actually held in this matter. Amy realized immediately that Lisa was intent on taking the prisoner away right then and there. Changing her tone, Amy stated clearly that she was simply performing her official duty. She invited Lisa to check her credentials, noting that she was acting under the direct orders of her superiors. Lisa countered by asking what right the police had to interfere with the choices of a private citizen. She suggested that Amy should consult with the individual in question regarding their personal freedom first. Amy grew quite angry at the suggestion, especially since Lisa seemed to be speaking in riddles. It was the first time we see Lisa speaking to someone else with such a sharp, commanding edge to her voice. We recall Lisa once mentioning that her sister was someone who kept her emotions hidden for very private reasons. But seeing Amy today, she seems a bit simple. Aside from her bold personality, she doesn't appear to have any hidden agenda at all. Lisa looked over at Ryan and told him it was time to head back for now. She suggested letting the public defense lawyers handle the communication with the police from here on out. Amy called out to Ryan from behind, admitting she couldn't stop him but asking for one simple promise. She told him that if he needed anything in 2 days, he should come to the station for the investigation without delay. Staying at the guest house, she explained, was actually for his own protection, or so she claimed. In truth, Amy had been quite kind since they met at the station, even letting him use her phone, making it hard to refuse her. Ryan looked at Amy and told her not to worry. If she needed his cooperation, she only had to call. He promised to be there when summoned, but upon entering the car, he found Leo and Sarah already waiting in the seats. Lisa sat in the back with Ryan, watching him closely as he settled into the vehicle. Leo leaned his head forward and said excitedly that Ryan probably hadn't expected things to turn out this way. When asked what he meant, Leo explained that this was clearly the handiwork of the second brother. He hadn't expected the second brother to handle things so cleanly and smoothly, a rare efficiency, to be sure. Ryan was still busy contemplating how to strike back and deliver a counterblow of his own. As he plotted his move, Leo pulled up the records and the current GPS location for the BMW X5. Leo had checked every possible route and suggested that the two of them head out together immediately. However, Ryan preferred to have a quiet conversation with Lisa back at the comfort of the hotel first. Soon, we find Lisa and Ryan alone together in the quiet atmosphere of the hotel lobby. Lisa placed a glass of water in front of him, gently suggesting that he take a drink and relax for a moment. She told him she had heard everything that had happened over the last few days. She promised to use all her connections to help him explain the truth of the matter. Lisa admitted she was no longer just a bystander watching from the outside, even if everyone else had already discovered the mistake she had made. As for Sophie, there seemed to be no possibility of saving her now. She smiled gravely, noting that she had already handed over many of the details. What did the misunderstandings of others matter? Lisa told Ryan she had listened to him. She urged Ryan not to be this way, knowing he was enduring a great deal of pain. If she were in his position, she told him, she would be just as heartbroken. She encouraged him to keep trying, though she admitted she wasn't sure how best to cheer him up. But no matter what, she was determined to do everything in her power to help him. Ryan looked at Lisa and asked why she was doing this, why she wanted to help him so much. They were only casual friends, yet Lisa simply watched him and said she felt a strange sense of kinship. She told him to rest there for the night, as she had a meeting early the next morning. After she left the room, Ryan took out his phone and deleted some messages from his second uncle. He lay down on the bed, attempting to get some sleep as early as possible. But finding it completely impossible to sleep, he decided it was better to head back home. When he arrived, we see him standing outside Sophie's room, looking at the door. He noticed her room was off to the side, and he prepared a bowl of sticky rice and cream. He lit 3 sticks of incense and placed them quietly before her. Late that night, Leo made a phone call after discovering that Jordan believed he had been in a car accident and needed to return home. He contacted the investigators, realizing with a heavy heart that he had been deceived all along. He explained that when the incident occurred, he was actually still in the car with his companion. Since he was the one driving, he questioned whether there was even a need to investigate these matters further. Leo specifically reported that, under current legal enforcement rules, several crimes had clearly been committed. He noted how dangerous Mr. Smith had become, even mentioning that he had doubled his efforts to repair the situation today. He had even used an app to track the location, completely repeating the entire story to ensure every detail was clear. Finally, he continued by recounting everything that had transpired throughout the day. It was, he felt, the only deserved outcome for their wrongful behavior. A bit of poetic justice, perhaps. Nick, the officer in charge of the case, then established a formal legal objective for the investigation. Leo assured him that he could provide complete and undeniable evidence for everything he claimed. During the time the incident took place, he had been accompanying Ryan, who was in the car with him the entire time. The vehicle's tracking sensors and the route surveillance monitors would prove their innocence beyond any doubt. He maintained his rights, explaining that on the day of the crime, he had gone to the city center for an interview. His staff had accompanied him, and it was on that very road that they encountered Jordan and the others. There was no intent to interfere. He insisted the investigation should be based on objective evidence, not extreme personal beliefs. After hearing the evidence, the police presented the legal regulations, noting there was now a significant reason to clear him of suspicion. The officers admitted they didn't approve of his previous attitude, but his innocence had now been proven. They advised him to cooperate with others and assist the public security department throughout the remainder of the investigation. He immediately replied that he understood, and to be honest, he was more than ready to put this behind him. Leo promised that he would cooperate fully with the entire investigation process. A little later, once the questioning had concluded, he invited Officer Nick out for a meal. The evening air was cool and early, and we see the two of them sharing a long conversation. To be honest, Leo felt Nick was a high-level officer who would remain professional even after the case was solved. Deep down, he knew the officer should probably maintain a healthy level of suspicion toward him. Yet, Nick remained focused on reaching a true understanding of who was actually innocent in this mess. He helped Leo secure the primary evidence needed, and finally, his name was cleared. After that, as dinner finished, Nick suggested that Leo stay the night in the guest quarters. The following morning, Leo was jolted awake by the urgent sound of Nick's voice at the door. It turned out that last night, the criminal records of the antagonist, Luke, had been leaked online. The Today Times had picked up the story, and now every major news station was focusing on the scandal. Nick asked if he was ready, noting that his young ward, Nina, and her grandmother were also involved. Both Nina and her grandmother were understandably devastated by the sudden media storm. As they wept, the grandmother eventually reached for her identification documents. She knelt before the cameras and told the entire story of what Luke had done to their family. In any normal situation, this would be shocking, but the truth was finally coming to light. Since Luke's family couldn't be reached, the authorities stepped in to handle the legalities of the recent passing. The family had wanted to go to the hospital earlier, but they simply hadn't been able to afford the costs. Finally, Nina's grandmother was laid to rest in her ancestral hall with the dignity she deserved. 3 days later, Nina reached out to Leo, inviting him to meet with the rest of the family. She informed Leo that Tiffany hadn't been rescued in time. She had already passed away. Once again, she questioned him to see if this news changed anything for him. He pretended to remain calm, though deep down, he was beginning to doubt her line of questioning. To be honest, the way she was handling this didn't seem to follow standard legal procedures at all. Nina looked incredibly stern, her voice steady without even the slightest hint of emotion. She explained that she was now reporting the details of the entire operation to him personally. We learned that they had already used technical media to cover up the specifics of the incident. They planned to continue their investigation throughout this period of time. Soon, they would be able to specifically intercept the drivers involved in this area. After they finished speaking, he ended the call, stood up immediately, and left the office. He wondered if he should warn his uncle to flee or if Nina was simply testing him. After considering his options, he decided to head to the gym to find her. He told her about Tiffany's death at the hospital, hoping to break her unsettling sense of calm. In a low voice, he told her that if she stayed hidden for a few days, his uncle would stop searching. He reminded her that they already knew who he was, and the police might be tracking her next. The man took a drag of his cigarette in the lounge, then quietly lowered his head as he sat on the edge of the bed. It was clear that he, too, was starting to feel a bit afraid of the consequences. After the man died, they asked her if the authorities would be able to recognize her. He had called to warn her about Tiffany's escape, but he was discovered, and his location was traced. That night, he tried to check the phone, but luckily Lisa appeared and came to find him today. He told Leo that Tiffany was dead and suggested that he should head over to the hospital. However, Lisa was worried about the risks at the clinic, and since she hadn't provided a ticket, he began searching through the authorized records of the staff. It seems he was merely relying on his role as an assistant guide, having failed his own exams in the past. He acted as a specialized systems operator, though deep down, he felt like he was just playing a part. At this point, he was nothing more than an ex-boyfriend watching the broadcast, trying to make sense of the situation. He looked at her and told her not to worry about foolish things, urging her to find a stable job quickly. He wanted to earn enough for her father's medical treatment, mentioning he had already sent $50 million to the house, just in case. The true cost of earning that money would be hidden, and though he pretended to be calm, he felt a sudden urge to break down. We see that life isn't always kind, yet he felt they simply had to endure it and keep moving forward. In a low whisper, James pointed out the absurdity of the situation, asking if acting like a child would solve anything. It turned out that the car involved had a license plate from a very remote area. She had been wearing a mask, and whether they could find her or not depended entirely on that young officer named James. He wondered if the officer would question him, opening his eyes to ask if it even mattered anymore. Currently, she is the only one who can trace your path, which is why we've been investigating this together. He asked her if she truly believed there was a high probability of a full investigation being launched. He didn't have an answer. He simply took a deep breath and lowered his head to take another drink. He hadn't known her for long, but he could sense that her firm sense of justice was genuine and direct. His uncle remained silent for a long moment before finally standing up and telling him to mind his own business. He suggested that Leo should go visit his parents whenever he could find the time. He spoke with a casual tone, but it felt as though he was giving final instructions for a future he wouldn't see. Our story takes a turn on the day Leo received an unexpected call from the police. The officer explained that Nina's father had been found, but delivered the crushing news that he refused to acknowledge her as his daughter. With Nina's mother still missing, the authorities arranged for a meeting at the station to sort through the mess. Leo couldn't help but worry that this encounter would be far from a happy reunion. The officer urged him to come down if he had the time, sensing that things might get unpleasant. He suggested they all gather there, noting that, in the end, Leo was the one most invested in the girl's welfare. Half an hour later, Leo arrived at the station and noticed a flashy red BMW parked right at the entrance. It turned out to be the father's car. The man behind the wheel of that luxury SUV was indeed Nina's father. One has to wonder how a man like that could let his own daughter suffer so much, but that is a long story. Nina mentioned that she and her grandmother's former colleague were already on their way to the station. We see them all waiting together in the main hall of the police headquarters. What they didn't expect was that once Nina and her grandmother arrived, the girl seemed like a completely different person. The old woman looked at Nina with a mix of confusion and desperation, asking where she had been all this time. Nina began to cry softly, explaining that her mother had actually abandoned her 3 long years ago. The grandmother was utterly stunned, having been kept in the dark about the true state of the family. We share in that surprise as Nina, her face tear-streaked, explained she had been left in a care center for 3 years. The father placed the divorce papers on the table, claiming he hadn't been in contact and assumed Nina was living well with her mother. He reached for a tissue to wipe his eyes, acting as though he couldn't fathom how such a tragedy had occurred. The old woman's expression remained frozen as she repeated the same question over and over. Where had Nina really been? She couldn't understand how 3 entire years could pass without a single word of the truth reaching her. After that, Nina left with her companion, and soon after, the grandmother departed as well. At noon, Nina unexpectedly invited Leo for a drink, saying she wanted to talk about her younger brother while sipping on some orange liqueur. She seemed hesitant to ask, but eventually wondered aloud if Miss Chun was actually a relative of his. She asked if he called the man uncle because he was his grandmother's son, and if he knew what the man really did for a living. Suddenly, Leo realized she might know something, remembering that she and Nina had appeared on the very night of the accident. Was this truly just a coincidence? To be honest, it seemed far too convenient for that. Leo felt a pang of suspicion in his heart as he watched Nina closely, waiting for her next move. He asked her what she was trying to say, but she simply brushed it off as if it were nothing at all. She claimed she only wanted to know more about Miss Chun, offering a small smile as Leo's parents and Nina prepared to leave. She insisted she was fine now that she knew her, but since she was staying with Miss Chun, she wanted to understand her true character. Leo remained silent for a few seconds before telling her not to worry, as Miss Chun's personality wasn't the problem. The real issue, he noted, was that she possessed an almost overwhelming sense of loyalty. Nina picked up her glass and offered a toast, though she still seemed to be holding back a difficult question. She finally asked if Miss Chun had ever been in prison, and more importantly, why that would be the case. She wondered if the woman was unbreakable, a comment that caused a deep sense of tension to wash over Leo. He looked directly into her eyes, only to find her staring back with an unwavering, piercing gaze. It was the kind of look that seemed designed to force a confession out of him right then and there. Leo picked up a bottle of wine and closed it, using the simple motion as an excuse to catch his breath. He then admitted the truth. Yes, she had been in prison, and more than just once. He explained that back when he was a student, she was practically a regular guest at the local police station. A few years ago, she had been sentenced to 6 months in prison. Leo hadn't heard about her time behind bars, mostly because the chaos of the accident had overshadowed everything else. Why don't we eat something? Alice suggested, clearly trying to steer the conversation towards safer waters. She pointed out that the chicken pot at this place was supposed to be quite delicious. She paused for a moment before adding that Joe was the only family she had left. She didn't want him involved in anything dangerous, and asked if Leo could tell Miss Chun to keep her distance from Joe. Leo simply nodded, lowering his head as he processed what she was asking of him. To be honest, he didn't even want to look at her. She was beautiful, certainly, but the situation felt increasingly strange. Leo, are you still looking for work? She asked, breaking the heavy silence. She wondered if he wanted to return to his old firm, but he politely declined the offer. He had cut ties there because of Felix, and besides, the boss had already returned home anyway. His priority now was to find a new place to stay and then look for a job in that area. The meal felt heavy with unspoken tension, and once they finished, Leo turned down the driver's offer for a ride. Instead, he called his uncle to ask exactly how many people had known about the accident on that fateful day. He needed to know why Alice and Luke were already at the house. His uncle was hesitant, but Leo pushed until he spoke. We learned that when the call came in, the uncle had been busy helping Luke with his martial arts practice. The uncle had to leave to deliver a message, and Luke had insisted on tagging along in the car. But after they arrived in South City, the boy had somehow managed to wander off and get lost. It was while the uncle was frantically searching for him that Luke ended up being involved in the accident. Alice had arrived to pick Luke up for dinner, only to stumble upon the horrific scene herself. We suspect Leo had already guessed the truth by then, though he chose to keep it to himself. It was clear that Luke was paying attention too, but he didn't see much point in protecting the secret anymore. Deep down, he simply didn't want Jane to be forced into destroying Luke's life. So, he wasn't worried about being reported. That night, with Mark's help, he moved into an old 2-story house. There was a small hall in the back, and behind one of the rooms, a delicate ladder led upward. The landlord was a man named Joe. He owned the first floor as well, though business was quite poor. Leo had just finished showering and was resting when his phone rang from an unknown number. It was the police, requesting that he come down to the station to cooperate with an investigation. The case was still active, and the local precinct had just released a formal report on the incident. The officer noted that Leo had reportedly made several threatening remarks at the scene. Leo firmly admitted to it. After all, the man had maliciously deceived both him and Sarah. In his mind, the entire incident had only resulted in some minor physical injuries anyway. The man had betrayed their trust and deeply hurt their feelings, which was far worse. He told the officer he only felt comfortable after venting some of that frustration with harsh words. When asked how long he stayed at the scene, Leo couldn't recall if it was 1 minute or 2. He remembered someone calling him over, but he only looked at the man's face, avoiding the rest of the body. He claimed he was afraid the sight of the accident would ruin his appetite for dinner later. The officer pressed further, noting that Leo was right there when the event actually occurred. The man had been driving while Leo was still in the car, and that was when the final words were exchanged. Finally, the officer stood up and thanked him for his cooperation, ending the tense interview. The officer told him to stay in touch, asking if he had any plans to travel in the near future. Leo explained he couldn't leave the country, though the officer clarified it was just a routine question. When he finally stepped out of the station, however, he didn't leave the area immediately. He had a lingering feeling that Mike would show up, and sure enough, 30 minutes later, he did. In fact, Mike arrived and got into his car almost instantly, while Leo lay low in the shadows. As he watched him, Leo noticed there were cameras positioned everywhere around the perimeter. Seeing all those lenses made him feel a sudden, sharp pang of guilt, and his mind went completely blank. He looked over at Charlie, who was still lying there, and after a few seconds, decided not to show himself. If he appeared now, Mike would undoubtedly think they were all just putting on a performance. Besides, a quick police check would easily show that he hadn't actually left the premises yet. We see him watching Charlie enter the station, silently praying the man wouldn't say anything damaging. His heart raced. If their stories about the mission didn't align perfectly, the consequences would be unimaginable. For a moment, he even considered running away, though he had no idea where he could possibly hide. 40 minutes later, Charlie finally reappeared and climbed back into the car. Immediately, Leo's phone began to ring, and a voice on the other end simply said, "I see you." The voice confirmed he was still in the car, and for the first time that night, Leo spoke. When asked why he hadn't left, Leo claimed he thought the others were joining them and had decided to wait. The caller asked if he was nervous, to which Leo coolly replied, "And why exactly would I be nervous?" The man said he was merely curious, but Leo told him to drop the subject entirely. The conversation ended with a simple instruction to wait for the next shift, where they would settle things. Leo put down the phone, feeling a wave of intense nerves that he was determined not to let show. Before getting back into the car, he had taken a moment to buy 2 bottles of soda. He wanted to keep Mike's attention, and a few minutes later, we see Leo finally getting into the vehicle. Taking a deep breath, he climbed inside and offered one of the sodas to his companion. He remarked that he knew Mike preferred this drink, hoping to break the thick tension between them. Mike's expression remained cold and blank, though he eventually reached out and took the bottle. Leo told himself to stay in the car and maintain an air of absolute self-confidence. It was a clear sign of how strained things had become, and we can see the weight of it on him. In moments like these, his emotional state was far more fragile than that of an ordinary person. He knew it was unusual, of course, for someone to be quite this high-strung over a simple gesture. He pretended to be calm, but the next day, he saw the news that changed everything. There was a report about a man's clothing being found with a very specific, incriminating toothpick. Leo had nothing to do with it, yet he knew it would be incredibly difficult to clear Mike's name now. When Leo refused to cooperate, Mike gave a cold sneer and asked why he was heading toward the city. Leo guessed that the investigator had likely asked Mike that very same question earlier. He pushed back, asking why Mike was being so difficult if he truly claimed to dislike the man. Mike then asked if he was nervous, pointing out a 3-minute call Leo made to a number ending in 4400. Leo realized then that he was being watched, and he wasn't particularly happy about it. Mike raised his voice, sounding focused and sharp as he called the whole situation foolish. He argued that without investigating these details, he could never provide justice for the case or the victim. Mike asked if Leo really believed that simply refusing to cooperate would help him uncover the truth. Leo quickly explained that the number Mike mentioned belonged to his second uncle. With such a major crisis unfolding, he wondered if there was really anything wrong with making a call. He raised his voice, trying to use a forceful attitude to mask the growing panic and silence in his heart. Mike watched him with an intense, focused gaze that seemed to pierce right through his defense. He argued that if he truly wanted to solve the case, he would have already verified Leo's identity through standard procedures. Then, we see Leo being questioned about the specific reason for his recent trip to the city. He claimed he only went there to eat, insisting that he was just as much a victim in this situation. When Mike pressed him on what exactly he planned to eat, Leo felt the pressure mounting. He claimed he couldn't remember the specifics, only that he had promised to enjoy the city's famous delicacies. Suddenly, he felt a sharp, unintended pang of pain in his chest that caught him off guard. Despite the discomfort, he managed to suggest they go for barbecue, trying to regain his composure. He refused to show any weakness while Mike continued to stare him down with an unyielding, silent intensity. The silence stretched on as Mike kept his eyes locked on him, weighing every word. The next day, Mike suggested a change of plans while they were near the coastal district. He spoke with a tone that suggested something far more serious was brewing beneath the surface. He warned that many people were waiting for them, handing Leo a silver tool as they approached a crowded bar. He noted it wasn't a lethal weapon, but insisted Leo use it to hold his own if things turned violent. Leo realized he couldn't stall any longer, and minutes later, their group of 6 entered the bar in the city center. And so, we find our characters inside the dimly lit bar, surrounded by a very dangerous crowd. Inside the bar, the atmosphere was thick with tension and the smell of stale drinks. We see that no one was happy when the police announced that after a brief investigation, everyone would be fined $5 million and must notify their families. The group pleaded with the officers, admitting their mistake and offering to pay the fine immediately if only their parents could be kept out of it. Leo quickly claimed his parents were deceased, but the officer was skeptical, asking how he could say such things about his own family. He insisted he wasn't lying, and upon checking the records, the officer found it was true. His family accounts had indeed been closed. With no other choice, a call was made to Kevin, who had just returned home when Lily arrived with a look of pure fury on her face. She demanded to know what he was thinking, reminding him that she had warned him not to involve Leo in his messes. She was livid, asking why on earth he had brought Leo along to a fight that ended with them in a police station. She stared him down, daring him to deny that this disaster had actually happened. Kevin tried to explain he wanted to refuse, but Lily rushed over and stood before him as Leo tried to intervene, telling his sister to stop. Leo argued that this was men's business and that helping his brothers was simply what was expected of him, taking the blame upon himself. Lily was so incredibly angry that her face turned pale, making the atmosphere in the room feel heavy and suffocating. She seemed beyond caring at that point, though deep down, she was likely just acting out of a sense of urgent protection. Kevin apologized, admitting he shouldn't have called Leo and promising that a situation like this would never happen again. Then, in a rare moment, Lily actually addressed him by his full name, Frank, though her voice was far from grateful. She shouted for him and his entire circle to stay far away from her brother from now on. She insisted they weren't the kind of friends her brother should have, before grabbing Leo and declaring they were done talking to them. Lily's grip was firm as she told him he was simply getting mixed up with the wrong crowd. Leo wondered how she could speak about others that way, sensing that if the argument continued, things would only get worse. He quickly tried to de-escalate the situation, telling Lily not to speak to her sister that way as they prepared to leave. Lily warned Frank that if he didn't come back right then, she would personally see to it that he regretted it. 2 days later, we see Sophie arrive with a second set of documents she had managed to gather. After reviewing the evidence, Frank decided to look into every company name associated with the family's inner circle. It turned out that all these companies were mere shells, existing on paper without any actual business operations. These front companies were being used as a smokescreen for the hotel's financial dealings, which was suspicious to say the least. They acted as suppliers, collaborating with the Danbury Group to sell low-quality products at inflated prices. The Danbury Group utilized a vast network of these shell corporations to manipulate their high-value assets. Through single-item transactions, they would funnel money out and immediately dissolve the company involved. By the time the Danbury Group officially noticed the quality issues, it was always too late to find anyone responsible. They were forced to absorb the losses and sign new contracts, which, naturally, was exactly what the conspirators wanted. The Danbury Group even had its own internal shell company to repeatedly handle these fraudulent payments. Over the past 3 years, they had used these tactics to cycle through 6 different ghost corporations. The evidence was now clear. The Danbury Group had been systematically drained through these fabricated liabilities. It was a calculated cycle of theft, repeated over and over again under the guise of legitimate business. If Frank could expose this, it wouldn't just save the company, it would protect everyone tied to its success. The legal and criminal nature of these actions was now undeniable, leaving a trail that was impossible to ignore. Frank expressed his deep gratitude to Sophie and asked her what she'd like to eat as a reward. He promised to treat her well, but she simply smiled and told him that a meal wasn't necessary. Sophie laughed softly and admitted that since she had helped him, she wanted to ask for a small favor in return. With a slight blush, she explained that her parents were constantly pressuring her to finally find a boyfriend. He figured he could spare just enough time to handle a single meal. Sophie explained that while her mother was quite pleasant, her father tended to be a bit more serious. She told him not to be nervous, even though she was practically grit her teeth from the pressure herself. With no other choice, Frank accepted, and that evening he spent his time organizing the Danbury Group's files. Deep down, he only hoped he could make a good impression on her family. Sophie warned him not to be fooled by her second uncle, who had cut ties after a heated argument. Only the Danbury Group had sent over any real information, and on his final day, Frank found himself having a drink. His mother called him then. She rarely reached out because she was always worried about the phone expenses. She had finally found the time to check on him, asking how he was with a voice full of quiet concern. She asked if work was going well, and he assured her he was earning more, though she warned him not to overwork. She told him to be careful and mentioned she was taking a break tomorrow because his father's diabetes was acting up. She had even sold the family's old chickens, and hearing her talk about his father's illness made Frank's heart sink. His mother had scraped together some money, but Frank, seen as a successful employee, made an excuse to send her $2,000 instead. He promised to call her the next day once he received his salary, and then he would finally go visit home. As he spoke, he could hear her start to cry, worried about his future, leaving him in a heavy, thoughtful silence. Afterward, we see Frank head to the gym to have a meal with his older brother, who was there every day. His brother was looking healthier than ever and suggested they head out to a local spot to celebrate. They enjoyed some drinks and grilled meat at the night market, enjoying the low prices and the lively atmosphere. There were about 7 or 8 of them ordering rounds of beer when, suddenly, 20 men surrounded their table. The leader claimed they owned the area and told everyone else to leave, as he was only there for one person. His older brother stood up and told Frank that he'd nearly scared him to death, relying far too much on raw strength during their sparring. We see his brother rise, still catching his breath from the intensity of the moment. Even his own brother, it seemed, wasn't quite prepared for the sheer force Frank was capable of unleashing. He had expected his brother to feel some pain, but he hadn't anticipated that the challenge would only make him more aggressive. A minute later, bottles began to fly, and with a sudden slide forward, a single kick sent the thug, Ben, flying 3 meters back. 20 men approached from the other side, closing ranks as they prepared to overwhelm them with numbers. At first, the opposing side looked pathetic, trying to use their superior numbers to intimidate the small group. But once Frank's brother landed a heavy blow on someone's head, the morale of the attackers completely collapsed. They all scrambled to get away, and Frank realized there was absolutely no reason for him to linger any longer. Interestingly, the gym owner, Derek, and the two trainers hadn't even lifted a finger during the scuffle. To be honest, they hadn't made much of an effort to stop the fight either. They just watched it unfold. They waited until the other side had completely fled before casually passing Frank a pair of chopsticks. Leo's face was a mask of panic and shame as he realized how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. Ben was the son of a high-ranking enforcer, and Leo feared that his involvement would bring a world of trouble down on them. He had endured a lot in the past, but escaping the consequences of a brawl like this was never easy. Frank's brother told them all to leave first, insisting that he would stay behind to wait for the police. Leo spoke up earnestly, taking the blame and telling Frank's brother that this whole mess was his fault. Derek urged them to hurry and leave, knowing that time was of the essence before the authorities arrived. He knew perfectly well that Frank's brother couldn't afford to end up in a police station right now. But his brother simply shook his head, keeping his composure as he prepared to face whatever came next. Leo and Frank's brother insisted they would stay behind, telling the others to leave and hoping for the best despite the misfortune. He told Frank to go as well, not wanting him to worry his parents after all the restless effort he had put in. And so they left. Derek hurried off to hail a car, and we followed them to a street in Century City. It was a high-end golf residence, a world away from the low-quality rooms they were used to seeing. When Derek's family arrived, he remembered seeing that SUV outside, and deep down, he felt a lingering sense of unease. The place was filled entirely with items belonging to a man named Charlie. Seeing they were already living together, Frank waited for nightfall, rolled up his sleeves, and drove the SUV toward a nearby ramp. He took off his hat and gave the vehicle a final push, watching as the car slowly drifted into the water. The water was deep enough at that spot to submerge it completely, out of sight and out of mind. By the time he returned at 3 in the morning, Derek was still waiting for him by the restroom. He asked anxiously how it went and if anyone had seen him, his voice thick with concern. Frank pulled off his hat and asked if Charlie had tried to make contact with him yet. He could tell Derek was still worried about how this whole incident would play out. Derek admitted he felt incredibly tense, as if he were just waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was a gut feeling with no scientific basis, of course, but such instincts are often remarkably precise. After a long night of talking, Derek took Frank to the station, hoping to help secure his uncle's release. However, the police reported that Leo had already been released by his family after paying a fine. But Frank's second uncle was still being held because of his direct involvement in the scuffle. He had been detained, and thinking back to a car accident months ago, Frank suddenly felt a surge of anger. This was exactly what they had feared, and he wondered why Charlie's affairs were suddenly complicating everything. Frank tried calling Leo 3 times, but each time the call was abruptly cut off. As we see, Derek was standing right beside him, mentioning that Leo's only family was his younger sister. He suggested calling the sister directly to ask if she knew anything about the current situation. They couldn't simply wait. Leo had become far too quiet lately, regardless of how things were turning out. It was clear they had to confront him and find a way to settle this once and for all. Despite his best efforts, Frank found it impossible to get through to Leo. No one answered the first call, but on the second attempt, a man named Charlie picked up. Charlie told him to stop calling Leo, claiming Leo didn't want to talk or cause any more trouble. If Leo was already out, Frank wondered why his second uncle was still caught up in other legal matters. It seemed Charlie was being intentionally vague, not wanting to reveal too much over the phone. When Leo finally took the phone, Frank warned him not to let the second uncle get mixed up with Charlie's mess. Since they wouldn't listen, Frank realized he would have to use his own methods to avoid a disaster. Leo held the phone, but even as Frank spoke, he felt completely powerless to change the outcome. He questioned Leo urgently, suspecting that the incident with a man named Shane had truly broken his spirit. While he was still speaking, Frank tried calling a third time, but Leo remained silent on the other end. Leo muttered a single sentence about finding a solution before simply walking away for the first time. Frank already had a grim answer in his heart, yet a small spark of hope led him to the local factory. He easily slipped into the inner workshop, bypassed the office door, and hurried straight toward the kitchen. He burst into the kitchen and demanded to know exactly what Leo had meant by his earlier words. With a deadly serious expression, Leo replied that he could endure anything unless Shane chose the wrong path. Leo explained that he only had this one brother, and his mother's final wish before passing was for him to protect him. He felt he was the only one who could look after him, fearing he could never face his late parents if something went wrong. Frank looked at him and asked if he truly considered his other brother's well-being in all of this. Tears welled in Leo's eyes as the weight of everything he had endured, the broken promises and the constant criticism, finally hit him. He was haunted by the thought that his own family had ruined his life, making us wonder if he was truly the guilty one here. Frank asked if Leo knew the truth of what happened, and if he felt any pain at all while judging him so harshly. Leo avoided Frank's gaze, staring off into the distance as if trying to escape the conversation. He admitted he didn't want to know the details. He only wanted a safe environment for Shane to grow up in, free from more trouble. Finally, the tears began to fall, and as Frank reached out, he told her he simply wanted the truth to be known. He asked again if she felt any remorse before turning to leave the kitchen, his heart heavy with pain and a growing sense of unease. That restlessness took hold of him, and in that moment, his thoughts drifted back to his old friend, Linda. With a long and uncertain road ahead, he wondered if he truly had the strength to see this through to the end. Suddenly, his phone rang. It was Linda. He answered quickly, telling her that he was in a desperate hurry. She urgently asked where he was going, telling him to turn off his phone immediately and avoid contact with anyone else. Linda promised she would find him, but warned him that he absolutely could not let the authorities track him down. She specifically mentioned the police, noting that if they couldn't find him, they couldn't force a statement, so he had to be careful. She told him to keep the phone with him, but to stay silent, leading Frank to ask if she was really coming for him. He wondered who she might bring along, and if he should really cut off his only line of communication right now. Linda then mentioned the manager of his family's company, someone who might still be able to help them navigate this mess. She promised they would talk properly once they met, but for now, the first priority was to turn off the phone. The manager of his family's company? We find ourselves just as confused as Frank is in this moment. Linda's family situation seemed quite unusual. When she arrived, she brought a middle-aged man in a black suit, simply calling him uncle. Linda explained that this was her uncle, her trusted manager, and assured Frank that they could trust him completely. Frank greeted him politely, thanking him for stepping in to help them during such a chaotic time. Uncle Joe told them not to be so formal since they were family, then sat down to begin reviewing the entire situation for the upcoming inquiry. He looked at Frank and asked directly if he had called Charlie on the night of the incident. Frank admitted that he had, confirming that he told Charlie exactly where he was at the time. He explained that he only wanted to say hello and truly hadn't expected anything else to happen, which, naturally, was a bit naive. Uncle Joe raised a finger, telling him to slow down, and asked again exactly what was said to Charlie that night. He asked if Frank knew how to answer the authorities now, and suddenly, the gravity of the situation began to click. Frank wondered in disbelief if his uncle was really suggesting they hide the truth for a second time. Uncle Joe coached him, suggesting that if asked if he saw Charlie, Frank should simply say he refused to meet. He insisted that Frank must say he never saw him and that no one had informed him of Charlie's presence. He questioned how Frank could be so sure it was him, noting that being near the scene didn't necessarily mean Charlie was involved. He pointed out that while Joe might have been there that night, Frank didn't actually see him with his own eyes, did he? Since there were no witnesses, he argued it would be unreasonable for an inquiry to proceed against Charlie without any real evidence. Linda chimed in, mentioning that Uncle Joe had been a respected judge for over 20 years, a comforting thought, perhaps. With a 99% success rate in his cases, he was certainly the man you wanted in your corner. She was certain that with him there, Joe would finally face the judgment he deserved for his actions. He had been involved in the drowning incident, but since the 4 witnesses hadn't faced Charlie yet, they claimed he must know his identity. They claimed that Charlie was only there to lead the way, specifically choosing to act as a guide during the inquiry's initial stages. The conflict with Charlie was growing more complex. They hadn't seen him in days, but now they expressed a heavy need for legal protection. Frank felt a wave of panic, realizing things couldn't continue like this, especially with the way the money was being handled. The need for a quick resolution was clear, and Uncle Joe reminded Frank that he was a man of justice who shouldn't shoulder this burden alone. His sister was deeply worried about him, and the weight of everything made him break down in tears, never expecting such selfishness from others. After a long and difficult struggle, he told her he didn't want to go home and face the mess, asking instead for a moment of comfort. We see him arriving at Sarah's house for their meeting, where she was already waiting with juice and coffee set out on the table. Sarah invited him to take a seat, but as he sat before her in silence, he noticed a flicker of neglect or perhaps sadness on her face. He admitted he hadn't known the situation would escalate this way, mentioning how both he and David were caught in the middle of it all. He recalled the moment she finally took him to the bar to confront the man responsible, a turning point in their journey. As he spoke these words, a sharp pain filled his heart. Sarah's face was swollen from crying, yet he took a drink and tried to push forward. He felt that life was a cycle of pain and brief relief, and though he couldn't run away, he wasn't afraid of the consequences anymore. However, there were things he couldn't give up on. His father's health was failing, and his mother was struggling just to keep working. He told Sarah he wasn't there to argue, but to ask a desperate favor. If he were taken away, would she look after his father? He needed to ensure his father received his treatments, fearing that if he didn't speak up now, he might never get another chance. He promised to pay her back every cent once he was able, and in a moment of pure desperation, he nearly fell to his knees. But it was Sarah who knelt first, hugging him through her tears and promising that she would never forget her responsibility to his family. She vowed to ensure his father had the money for his doctors, declaring that from this day forward, his father would be treated as her own. Sarah stood up from the bedside, her eyes red from crying, and though she tried to hide her emotions, the silence between them spoke volumes. That silence didn't last long. That evening, she decided it was time for them to go home together, regardless of the risks they faced. That evening, we see them in the car on the way to meet her father. Sarah and Frank drove back to their hometown in her sleek red and white sedan. The car had been a gift from a wealthy executive named Mr. Duke, who, to be honest, was hoping Frank would marry his daughter. As they traveled, Sarah shared many things with him, but what stood out most was her natural talent for managing the family's finances. She had invested her savings wisely, which was exactly why her father wanted her to take over as the company president one day. After driving for 4 hours, we find them stopping at a hotel at 1 in the morning. Sarah didn't quite understand why they didn't just go straight home. Frank knew his father would be asleep, and his mother would be out in the cold tending to him, so he decided it was best to wait until morning. He barely slept that night, his mind racing with thoughts of his father. The next morning, they bought some fresh greens and a pound of meat. They found his mother on the street selling grilled meat, and when she saw him step out of such a luxury car, she was overcome with worry. Frank stepped forward to greet her, and his mother looked at Sarah in complete surprise, wondering who this elegant woman could possibly be. He introduced Sarah as his close companion, and she warmly greeted the older woman, asking if Frank's father was resting at home. Frank insisted they close the stall for the day so they could all have lunch together, having brought plenty of meat for a proper family meal. His father was overjoyed to see them, and Sarah was incredibly sweet, addressing his parents with the kind of respect that warmed their hearts. The mood turned somber when Frank mentioned his sister needed looking after. His parents immediately felt the weight of the family struggles. Sarah didn't hesitate to help, insisting on washing the dishes herself after lunch while Frank prepared to return to his work. That evening, Frank retreated to his old room to rest, a tiny space of barely 8 square meters where he had spent so much of his life. He wondered if he would ever return here again, while his father wept, feeling like a broken man and a burden to his own son. His mother quickly comforted him, reminding him that he wasn't alone and that their family simply couldn't function without him. That night, Sarah and Frank shared the small bed where his ex-girlfriend used to sleep. It was a bit uncomfortable at first, but she eventually drifted off. The following morning, the police called and summoned Frank to the station. When he told Sarah, she immediately feared he was trying to run away. He tried to reassure her that he would face the law, but as he hung up the phone, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Upon returning to the city, Frank bought a local SIM card and placed it in Sarah's phone. On the way home, he called Jane to see how she was holding up. She asked if he had made it home yet, and we see him reflecting on the previous night's struggle to resolve his family's heavy burdens. He wept softly, knowing that at 2 in the morning, he was expected at the police station to cooperate with the ongoing investigation. Jane whispered that the police were already watching him closely because he had made some inconsistent statements during the initial questioning. He wondered what he should say in his report. Initially, he denied being at the sports academy, but the police had photographic evidence of his presence. The police had reviewed his phone records and were convinced of his guilt, lacking only the final proof. Frank felt a wave of pure panic wash over him. He felt he should simply confess that everything was his fault, but Jane urged him not to rush, reminding him that he was his family's only hope. She told him that his primary duty was to protect his parents, who still relied on him, especially since the police lacked sufficient evidence for an arrest. As she looked for a way to save him, Frank couldn't hold back his tears. The situation felt both grave and, in a dark way, almost absurd. He hung up the phone and broke down, but when he heard Sarah approaching, he quickly composed himself and went to prepare some drinks. His only wish was to protect his family, yet he felt a lingering doubt about his safety as they remained near the city outskirts. Despite his hesitation, he finally called Mr. Duke, who sounded grateful to hear from him after receiving Frank's earlier message. Mr. Duke's voice came through the line with a light chuckle, but Frank was far too consumed by his own pain and anxiety to share the joke. Frank asked if he could truly trust him, and Mr. Duke's voice immediately turned serious, affirming their friendship based on their shared history. Taking a deep breath, Frank tried to silence the doubts in his heart, realizing that Mr. Duke had likely already guessed the truth. He asked if the man knew about the connection to the car accident. There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line for several seconds. Mr. Duke noted that the police only care about proven evidence, and there was no need for Frank to be frightened by things that hadn't been proven yet. Frank fell silent as he learned the police had confirmed his presence at the scene on the day of the crime. Someone had already informed them. The police station sent a notice for him to arrive early for questioning, and as he prepared to go, his mind was a complete blank. Mr. Duke's voice remained calm and steady, telling him not to be intimidated and that they would define their strategy, starting with the first step. Mr. Duke explained that since they were together in the car all day, the dashcam footage would provide an airtight defense of their route. He promised to submit a legal report with full evidence to counter the allegations. It was, as he put it, an irrefutable strategy. The details of Frank's conversation with Sarah about going to the city outskirts were vital, and Mr. Duke intended to testify to the truth. He reminded Frank that the police must follow the facts, and without concrete evidence, no one could be judged or convicted. Frank agreed to head to the station that evening. Checking his phone, he estimated he would arrive in about an hour. Mr. Duke told him to remain calm and firm, promising to finish his business and join him shortly. His voice was steady and reassuring. Frank asked if he could really pull this off, fearing that once he began cooperating with the investigation, they might never let him go. Mr. Duke firmly disagreed, noting that cooperating with the law is a civic duty and that they had clear evidence of his innocence. He told Frank there was no need to worry and that they would speak soon. With that, Frank ended the call and took a breath. As they drove, Leo suddenly broke the silence, asking in a low voice if Frank truly disliked his sister that much. Frank hesitated to answer, but Leo quickly added that he understood, as even he found her difficult despite her being his sister. Leo promised that no matter what happened, he would take care of their parents. Frank looked at him, feeling a wave of unease. He realized that if you don't want people to know your secrets, you shouldn't keep them. Eventually, the truth always finds a way out. Upon returning to the district, they skipped lunch and went straight to the police station, where Leo waited by the entrance. Inside, we see Frank sitting quietly while officers documented his arrival and began checking his phone records. Everything seemed to be proceeding smoothly, so he set his belongings aside and prepared himself for the questioning. He focused on the task at hand, trying to remain as composed as possible under the watchful eyes of the investigators. He didn't ask Sarah about her work or family, and she only offered brief, occasional responses to his questions. Her mother seemed lost in her own world, while Sarah sat at the table playing a mobile game, barely looking up. When food was served, Sarah shared a piece of fruit with her mother, who mentioned she hadn't eaten all day. She opened the package and showed her mother, noting with a smile how much the plant had grown in secret. We see Sarah turn toward her mother, pausing her game as Frank arrives for the very first time. Her mother planned to get out and buy some vegetables, wanting Frank to join them for dinner that evening. After that, Sarah's mother mentioned that Frank seemed like the type who really enjoys fried chicken. She teased him, saying she suspected he was actually the one who wanted to eat it. Sarah's mother laughed and told Frank to make himself comfortable while she headed to the supermarket for the chicken. Frank offered to go with her, promising he would be back in just a moment if they went together. Sarah left her phone behind and stood up, prompting her mother to ask where she thought she was going. Her mother looked at her, noting she only seemed to cause trouble, and insisted on going herself. Frank insisted on acting as the driver, and by the time they returned home, Sarah had finished her work. Facing her, he felt a wave of nerves, likely because he felt a bit guilty about the situation with the young lady. Surprisingly, she didn't ask about his studies or income. She only asked if he knew how to play traditional chess. He wasn't an expert, but he played slowly, carefully observing how the other players made their moves. She kept encouraging him, telling him to take his time and not to feel rushed, which was kind of her, really. The match lasted nearly an hour without a clear winner until Sarah's mother finally called them for dinner. During the meal, the head of the household asked Frank if he would like something to drink. He accepted a drink with Sarah, though he had spent the whole day acting as her personal driver. He served Sarah some food, trying to see her as a competitor, and later she took him out for a walk. It's worth noting that the chess match had ended in a draw before they moved on with their evening. He took a deep breath and told the lady it was time for them to head out. She answered the phone and let out a surprised cry, asking Frank if he was finally awake. She asked if he was busy at the moment, as there was something important she needed to tell him. Frank replied that he was indeed busy and had to stay where he was, unable to leave just yet. Confused, she asked what he could possibly be doing at the hospital entrance of all places. She paused for a moment before explaining that her father was in the hospital and things were coming to a head. We learned that her father was hospitalized, and she was certain something serious had happened to him. When asked what kind of hospital, she gave a small, nervous laugh, reminding him it was their father they were talking about. Lily confirmed the news, explaining that he was currently undergoing a procedure for a spinal issue. If the procedure was successful, he wouldn't need surgery, though he would still need weekly hospital visits for treatment. The spinal issue was being addressed, though Frank couldn't quite make out everything she was saying. Yes, it was a bit chaotic. She spoke with great pride, mentioning she hadn't wasted a moment this week finding a specialist and contacting the hospital. Within just 3 days, she had found the right treatment and even managed to settle the costs. She had brought a doctor to inspect the supplies and immediately moved her father to a specialized suburban hospital. She jokingly asked if she wasn't incredibly efficient, suggesting he owe her a movie night later as a reward. Frank asked Lily if she was joking, knowing full well this wasn't the kind of thing anyone would joke about. She explained that she and her father were in Shanghai. She had lied and said Frank was busy but would arrive after the liver and kidney surgeries. The cost was $4 or $5 million, but she told him not to worry about the money, as their father would recover soon and return home next week. He didn't argue, but then he heard the mother leave the bathroom. 10 seconds later, her voice came through the line, calling out to Frank. His mother was shocked, asking why he hadn't told her about taking them to Shanghai for the liver surgery, but he assured her it was fine. He told her to focus on the surgery first, promising to fly out tomorrow despite the high costs of travel and staying in the city. The mother asked if he was still there, noting how expensive international calls were, and wondered if he had anything else to tell his friend before hanging up. Frank chuckled as his friend took the phone back, asking how he was doing and thanking him profusely for the help, promising to work like a dog for him in the future. He joked about working like an ox or a horse, but Frank didn't want to change the subject, wondering if they had truly become like brothers through all of this. To be honest, Frank had planned the hospital arrangements and the spinal specialist himself, while Lily had simply stepped in to handle the actual operation for his parents. His friend suggested that if Frank wanted to show his gratitude, he should focus on Lily. After all, she was beautiful, and he had nothing to lose by being kind to her. Frank knew that a major spinal surgery was far too important for his friend to have managed alone. It was almost certainly Lily who had taken charge of everything. As he hung up, he began to think of how to properly thank Lily. While nearby, Nate finished the last of the eggs while listening to the news of the father's surgery. Nate gave a small smile, suggesting that Lily might feel responsible for the situation, since without her report, the police wouldn't have targeted the suspect so aggressively. It seemed as though she was spending money just to buy some peace of mind, but Frank was grateful regardless, even as he realized Nate had eaten all the breakfast food. Nate had polished off every egg and chicken leg, looking up with a sheepish, slightly sad grin to apologize for forgetting to leave anything for Frank. This eccentric personality of Nate's was truly something to behold, and after staying by Frank's side for 2 hours, he finally took his leave. Regardless of Lily's motives, Frank decided to hold on to this sense of gratitude, though he felt his own status was perhaps too low to even approach her. The memory of being deceived in the past was still fresh in his mind, and even when they met at her house later, the interaction remained brief and distant. There was a clear barrier between them that kept him up all night, until he finally decided to go to the Grand Hotel to find Lily and thank her properly. At the hotel, he ran into Sarah, who seemed to be in quite a hurry, asking if he was there to see her or the CEO, Mr. Lee. Frank explained he wanted to thank Lily and perhaps share a drink with Sarah, but she whispered a warning that there was trouble brewing with the management board. It appeared that because Lily had been misled, Mr. Lee was planning to use the mistake as an opportunity to seize the presidency for himself. Sarah suggested they move to the 3rd floor to talk privately, urgently reminding him that the powerful Mr. Duncan was currently in his office. Since he couldn't see anyone else at the moment, Frank sat aside with Sarah, who whispered that the board meeting was about to begin under Mr. Lee's direction. The person in charge, a man named Dan, began criticizing Lily for losing $8 million in company funds due to a criminal's deception the previous Monday. They seized the opportunity to propose that Lily's authority be slashed, insisting that the loss of over $5 million be formally recognized as a total organizational failure. However, some shareholders granted her 3 days to explain the use of the funds before deciding if the $5 million could be retroactively approved, a slim hope, to be sure. Being president is more than just a title, and as Frank finished his coffee, he realized the internal struggle for control of the company was becoming incredibly fierce. Dan was clearly one of Mr. Lee's men, and while some shareholders followed his lead, many others still supported Lily, especially during the lunch meeting regarding the funds. While they were discussing the need for leadership signatures, Dan walked into the cafe and sat down right across from Frank, telling Lily not to worry about the situation. He claimed to have information that could help her. Dan boasted that he had all the financial data ready if anyone needed it, and after he hung up his phone, Sarah asked Frank if he was worried about the other staff members. Frank remained silent, knowing that the waters in this company ran very deep, especially since Mr. Lee and his team were determined to bring Lily down over the $8 million. Dan held the evidence in his hands, and after making a brief comment to the other side, we see him preparing to return to the executive offices. As Dan and Frank went back to work, Frank stopped by Lily's office and rang the bell, only to be met by her assistant who asked what he was doing there. Lily's voice drifted from inside, asking who it was, and upon seeing the man who had been detained just 3 days prior, she gave him a cold look before letting him in. We find them alone as Lily offers him a glass of water with a faint smile, though Frank felt he should apologize after learning about the corporate battle she was facing. He felt terrible, realizing that if he hadn't been deceived by the scammers, she wouldn't be facing such harsh criticism or the loss of her reputation. He explained that he came to thank her, knowing that without her help, his father's $3 or $4 million spinal surgery would have been an impossible dream. He admitted he had no way to pay her back yet, and while a bolder man might have jokingly asked to marry her as repayment, Frank found himself at a loss for words. To be honest, such a proposal would have been absurd, so he simply stood there until she firmly asked why he was silent, causing his face to turn a deep shade of red. He wanted to tell her not to hesitate to ask him for help, but he felt too powerless for those words to mean anything, so he decided to keep them to himself. Lily laughed and told him he had said quite enough, but Frank, nearly moved to tears, told her he knew she had paid for the surgery to ease her own conscience. He looked at her, asking if she really didn't want his gratitude or for him to take some responsibility, but she simply looked back with an unreadable expression. She told him that if he brought her a simple bowl of jelly noodles, they would be even, leaving Frank stunned that his debt could be settled so easily, unless she was joking. The request to return to the company as the chief of security felt heavy, so Frank went out and bought the jelly noodles before returning to the restaurant to find Lily. We see Lily leaning over the table, her gaze lost in space, until Frank presented her with a bowl of cheese-flavored ice cream to accompany the meal. She looked up, carefully opened the package, and took a bite with a smile that radiated pure joy. When he asked if she was satisfied, she admitted she loved the treat. Closing her eyes, she asked Frank what his own favorite dessert was, and he had to admit that his childhood memories were somewhat sparse. He recalled a simple 5-cent bun his uncle used to sneak for him, and as they shared their sweets, Lily looked quite confused by the story. She couldn't quite understand why a man would have to sneak around for dessert, but after finishing her noodles, she suddenly asked Frank what he had planned next. She decided to take him to Thunder River, a place Frank soon realized hosted a very specific type of recreational activity, one he would have avoided had he known the truth. Since childhood, he had been terrified of heights, and standing 100 meters up, the view below made him feel dizzy and exhausted. Lily looked at him and asked if he wanted to try the jump, claiming the wind in his ears would make him forget all his worries, a rebirth of sorts. Frank thought she was crazy, worrying about safety risks, but she just laughed and said that if life is exhausting, a little danger might be a good thing. With a wave of her hand, she jumped, leaving Frank to rush to the edge and watch her figure grow smaller and smaller as she fell. A staff member excitedly asked if he wanted to try, noting that many people come here to face what feels like a moment of death to conquer their fears. The worker mentioned that Lily came often, though usually alone, which surprised Frank. He wondered if she was truly seeking out such a brush with mortality. The staff member laughed, explaining people come to release stress, but Frank quickly dismissed the idea, wanting nothing more than to leave that high ledge. Half an hour later, we see him with Lily again, and though he felt there was something different about her now, he chose to keep the observation to himself. He called her foolish for taking such a risk, and asked if she was only doing this to block out the pressure others were putting on her. He told her she could consider him her protector now, which made her eyes light up, though she joked that his stiff posture made him look more like a pig catcher. Lily teased him until he realized he had said something awkward, causing him to turn his head toward the window to avoid her gaze. Standing beside her, he asked if she was using these thrills to test the limits of life, but she naturally replied that life isn't something one can simply test. She asked if they could finally have a real conversation instead of bickering, turning to look at him with a sudden, sharp intensity. Frank continued to stare out the window, pretending he hadn't noticed her teasing, while the bus rolled through 6 or 7 stops toward a different part of the city. He stood up and asked her to let him pass so he could get off, wondering if this was how she usually spoke to her business associates like Lordle. A wry smile played on Lily's lips as she pointed out that since she had saved him, helping her with a difficult person was only fair, a logical trade, in her mind. Frank insisted on getting off the bus, and we see the two of them arriving at a bustling market district nearby, though he was still questioning her motives. Lily led him directly into the market, complaining of hunger since she only ever cooked at home, while Frank tried to lighten the mood with a few jokes. He told her it was fine as long as she didn't make him pay, a comment that earned him some very disapproving looks from the nearby vendors. Lily didn't bother defending him, simply asking if he could be more serious for once, which led to a confusing back and forth about his reputation. With a small smile, she finally chose a Korean barbecue restaurant, declaring she couldn't walk another step without a proper meal. Frank joked that her constant complaints were a workout in themselves, but Lily ignored the jab and focused her attention entirely on the menu. She began to ask about his current employment, noting that while he seemed busy lately, he didn't appear to have a steady, full-time job. She asked if he had truly considered returning to Ditsai, mentioning that many senior executives had actually approved of his performance. It was hard to believe, but in just 3 days, he had shifted the entire security department's dynamic, even though he had already turned down the new director. Lily's expression became quite stern as she sat across from him, making it clear that it was time for a serious, honest conversation about 2 specific matters. First, she admitted she couldn't control her brother, but she asked Frank to ensure his sister, Cynthia, didn't get caught in the crossfire of their rivalry. Deep down, she was worried about the fallout, and her second point was even more direct. She sincerely wanted him to return to the company. She watched him closely, searching for an answer in his eyes while assuring him that her belief in his talent was genuine, not just a corporate ploy. She reminded him that the security team respected his leadership and vision, and she wondered if he was ready to stop drifting and come back. She argued that while he could survive on small odd jobs or delivery work, he shouldn't be wasting his potential on such temporary fixes. Lily spoke with firm conviction, telling him he should focus on long-term growth rather than just chasing quick cash for immediate needs. Frank was moved. Previously, his only goal had been his father's medical bills, but in this quiet moment, he realized someone finally cared about his future. Frank thanked her for her honesty, admitting she was right and asking for time to think before they discussed his future further. He then asked if she had been a good student back in the day. Lily admitted with a sigh that she'd only scored 60 points on a high-tech exam because she skipped the essay, despite the total being 600. Her eyes widened as she spoke, looking quite surprised herself. We see them eating and chatting for nearly an hour, and when Frank asked for more advice, she told him he could invite her to dinner anytime he needed guidance. After that meal, the bond between Frank and Lily felt subtly different. 2 days later, Lily suddenly informed him that his father's surgery had been a complete success. There were no signs of rejection from the transplant, and she told him to meet at the airport at 1 o'clock to help move his father. It was the news he had been waiting for. The constant weight in Frank's heart finally lifted, leaving him in a state of quiet peace. He called his brother to share the news, only to find Lily had already told him. After a quick lunch, Frank rushed to the airport station where he found his father and brother walking together. Lily was sitting nearby on a bench, focused on some documents. They clearly knew each other, but in that moment, they were all on their best behavior. His brother, Mike, called out to him first, acting with his usual boisterous energy. Frank told him to stop being so annoying, which earned him a playful curse in return. He then walked over to Lily and stood before her as she looked up from her papers. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and noted that he'd already heard from the doctor. Now that his father's condition was stable, she told him he should finally relax. Frank was deeply grateful and mentioned his mother's delicious cakes, promising that once things settled, he would have his mother prepare a special meal for her at their home. Lily immediately accepted the invitation, holding him to his word. After that, she went to greet Frank's father and his brother, Mike, who was busy making introductions. After Mike introduced Lily to their father, and they exchanged a few words, Frank finally spoke up, asking his father if he felt better thanks to Lily's help. He knew that without her, the second half of his father's life would have been ruined. His father was filled with gratitude, but Lily insisted he shouldn't be thanking her. Frank then introduced his sister, Cynthia, to the group. His father was visibly moved, thanking Lily for her kindness while she responded with a warm, modest smile. It seemed Mike and the others were becoming like one big family, and Lily agreed that they shouldn't be so formal with one another. His father nodded in agreement. Deciding not to linger at the airport, the five of them headed to the parking lot. There, they found Lily's car, a sleek GL8, waiting for them. Mike was surprised to see her driving this particular vehicle instead of her usual Range Rover, which she explained was currently in the shop for maintenance. Lily mentioned she had a second car for work and prepared to leave, asking Frank if he could handle the driving duties since he was familiar with the route. She stopped talking and gestured toward the driver's seat. Since he knew the city better than anyone, she decided it was best to let him take the wheel. She remained silent for a moment, simply handing him the keys and waiting for him to take them. Frank looked into her eyes and asked if she had taken the company's money just to pay for his father's spinal surgery. He suspected her Range Rover wasn't at a shop, but was sold or hidden to protect company assets, leaving Lily visibly shaken by his questions. She didn't give him another chance to pry, walking around to the passenger seat instead. We returned to the city where they shared a simple lunch before heading to the hospital. Once there, Lily insisted on covering every single medical expense for the follow-up care. The doctors suggested a stay of a week to 15 days to ensure a full recovery. Frank's parents felt such a long stay was unnecessary, but Lily wouldn't hear of it. To be honest, she was far more stubborn about his father's health than the man himself. The family settled in, and Frank stayed by his father's side as the older man rested on the hospital bed. His father began to speak about the hospital's strict instructions. The doctors had been incredibly thorough, repeating their advice over and over to ensure the family understood the gravity of the recovery process. It was a long list of protocols and medical requirements, but the staff made it clear that following these steps was the only way to guarantee he would walk properly again. Frank's brother, Mike, joked that he could handle the old man easily, which made Frank smile. Still, Mike's sudden calmness was unusual, and Frank couldn't help but ask a question. He asked Mike if he knew the police were looking for him. Mike admitted he knew, speaking with a strange, detached indifference that made the whole situation feel quite meaningless. Frank tried to push further, asking his brother if he had any plan or even a single thought about how to handle the looming legal trouble. Mike confessed that while he had doubts about Lily, he understood her position. Understanding, however, is not the same as being convinced, as we often learn the hard way. He pointed out that she paid for their father's surgery, millions that would have taken them 18 years to earn. For that alone, they owed her a debt of gratitude. Mike felt he could manage the fallout. Even if they weren't friends with the law, they didn't have to be enemies. Frank felt a quiet unease at his brother's casual attitude. He worried Mike's reckless stance would lead to something extreme. Mike simply turned and told him that just because he was calm didn't mean he was being foolish. He told Frank that no one was forcing him to stay, and if he couldn't handle the pressure, he should leave. Frank felt a flash of anger, but he chose to stay for his father. Looking at Lily chatting happily with his father, Frank felt a fierce need to protect them. He remembered how Mike and his father had struggled, and he didn't want to run away. It wasn't that he needed rest. He just felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to find Lily and speak with her privately, even if they just sat in silence for a while. Before he knew it, he was at Lily's apartment complex. The security guard stopped him at the entrance, explaining that the residential area was under strict access control. As the guard prepared to make a call, Lily arrived on a scooter, clutching a designer bag. In a surprising display of wealth, she handed the staff a massive tip as she passed. The staff member handed her a massive tip. When she saw Frank, she looked caught off guard, asking why he wasn't at the hospital with his father. He couldn't help but wonder why she wasn't worried, carrying a designer bag and hopping onto a scooter without a single fear of being recognized. Lily looked like a character straight out of a classic film, seemingly detached from the chaos of their current reality. She showed him a pass she had used to get through the streets, explaining her recent movements with a casual shrug. After a moment, her face flushed slightly. Frank turned to her, demanding an explanation for everything that had transpired. He asked point-blank if she had sold her assets to pay for his father's spinal surgery. She simply nodded, answering with a quiet yes. She explained that she and her partner only held shares in the company, which weren't exactly liquid assets at the moment. They lived on their monthly salaries, she admitted, and certainly didn't have hundreds of thousands in spare cash lying around. So, they had to sell the car first. Frank asked if she had taken company funds and then sold the car to cover the tracks before being caught. He pressed her for the truth, but Lily stopped walking. She asked him quite simply if the how really made any difference now. When he asked why she would go to such lengths, she confessed it was just so he could have some peace of mind. The weight of her words hit him all at once. He found himself momentarily speechless as the reality of her sacrifice set in. He told her it was far too much for anyone to do, but she just kept walking forward, refusing to dwell on the cost. She told him he didn't need to worry about her reasons or the trouble she might be in because of it. She reminded him that he hadn't even asked for the money. To be honest, she had taken the burden upon herself entirely. He asked why she was acting so tense. He reached out, speaking with a sincerity that he hadn't shown before. He thanked her. Regardless of her reasons or the methods she used, he knew what she had done for his family. He told her, with a voice full of genuine emotion, that he thanked her from the very bottom of his heart. He admitted he had no idea how he could ever repay her, but he felt a desperate need to do something in return. Lily looked at him and then down at his hand. He felt her fingers brush against his, a small gesture that spoke volumes. She told him not to say such things, as if he were trying to let her into his heart and soul. She admitted she couldn't handle that kind of weight, and he quickly pulled his hand away. He insisted he was being sincere, but she warned him not to take her kindness so lightly. She pulled her hand back, telling him not to mess with her or ruin her future prospects. After saying her piece, she turned away and headed toward the entrance of the stairwell. But after a few steps, she paused and turned back to look at him one last time. She asked what was on his mind, and if he didn't want to just sit down for a moment. He declined, saying he felt better just seeing her, but that it was time for him to head back. She wished him a good night, and as he walked away, he looked back to find she was already gone. He still didn't fully understand the true reason she helped him, whether it was for peace of mind or out of regret. To be honest, he hadn't received a clear answer, and he simply had to accept that for now. As we see him leave the quarantine area, he spent a small fortune on traditional red envelopes for luck. He believed this would aid his father's recovery, and he paused to take a long, thoughtful drag of his cigarette. He stood there for a long while, lost in the smoke and his own swirling thoughts. He looked through his things, wondering if things could truly be this simple or if he was just being optimistic. He wondered why things had escalated to this point, searching for a logic that wasn't there. Not knowing how to begin, he took a deep breath and decided to push the past aside to focus on the present crisis. Feeling awkward, he picked up the phone and, with a bit of nerves, invited a friend to a hotel just to listen to music. His friend laughed, noting that people usually go to hotels to drink, not for a private concert. He was reminded that he really shouldn't be drinking anyway, given everything that was at stake. He knew deep down that he really shouldn't be doing this. Drinking was the last thing he needed right now. Not a single drop of alcohol. He repeated to himself, knowing he shouldn't drink, reminding himself again that drinking was out of the question, as if saying it enough times would make the temptation vanish. Because he truly shouldn't be drinking at a time like this. Not when there was so much work left to be done. His friend promised to support him with everything he had, though he warned that guessing blindly was simply meaningless. He called him a bit of a fool, but promised the necessary data, provided he didn't forget their agreement. After talking for over 2 hours about their hopes and problems, we see him finally return home. He sent a voice message to Gary, asking about Leo's recent suspicious moves and what Chris was up to. It turned out Leo was in major trouble, as rumors spread that he was embezzling company funds while his approval plummeted. Kevin took the chance to have Leo detained, and though our protagonist tried to intervene, the situation looked grim. Leo had been cast aside, and Gary noted that everyone could see Kevin's influence was secretly growing. From an objective standpoint, people were losing all faith in Leo after his public financial blunders. He couldn't understand why Leo would expose his finances now, but Gary explained that the treasurer was Kevin's man. They were in control now, and he wondered if they would ever let their grip on the company slip away. He knew he had to try, even after realizing the massive risks Lisa had taken for him. She should have considered the consequences, and yet, she chose to act anyway. Later that afternoon, we see him heading over to the police station to meet with Ian. Ian tossed the documents down, explaining that everything he needed to prove the case was right there. It was more than enough to show that Dan, Kim, and the purchasing manager had been stealing funds. As for how to use it, Ian told him he was on his own now that his part was done. He reminded Ian of their talk, mentioning he'd bring a couple of lanterns to his house that night. But Ian just looked at him, his expression suggesting that things weren't quite settled yet. Ian rolled his eyes, making it clear he wasn't in the mood for any more games. He was still on the clock, after all, and something big was clearly starting to unfold. A president had been invited suddenly to remove Lisa from her post, and Chris feared the day would end poorly. He apologized, realizing their evidence wasn't quite ready to be posted on the company website just yet. His earlier suspicions had been cleared, and he thanked Ian for choosing to cooperate with him. Once the questioning finally came to an end, we see them leaving the investigation area together. Ian returned to his usual cheerful self, even giving him a friendly, impulsive hug. He then turned to the others to introduce a man who had been watching, his father. This was Arthur, the man currently leading the bank's specialized police task force. He noted that his daughter was quite skilled at keeping her professional and private lives separate. Arthur couldn't help but chuckle at the situation before turning his full attention toward Chris. He offered a sincere apology to young Chris for everything he had been forced to endure. In their line of work, he explained, they must prioritize hard evidence over personal relationships. They would never intentionally try to frame a good man, which is a comforting thought, at least. Suddenly, Ian playfully swatted at Chris's hand, breaking the tension of the moment. She asked him what he was staring at and told him to hurry up and apologize to her father. Chris greeted the man politely, noting that it was a bit strange to meet under these circumstances. Arthur simply laughed it off, assuring him that there was no harm done at all. He suggested that Chris and Ian head home first, as Ian's mother had already prepared dinner. Arthur promised they would have a good talk tonight, fully believing Chris was Ian's actual boyfriend. As they headed to the car, Ian noticed his mood and remarked that he seemed quite unhappy. She asked why he had turned off his phone and vanished during their last fake dating mission. Chris insisted he wasn't avoiding her and promised to follow through on everything he'd said. He wasn't so much afraid of her father, but Ian warned him that Arthur had ways of testing people. She told him to be careful tonight, as her father wouldn't get angry as long as he treated her mother well. Chris wondered if he could really make her mother happy with a gift worth only $200. He ran a hand through his hair and asked the question, earning a playful eye roll from Ian. She explained her family didn't need gifts. The best way to please her mother was to take care of her. After navigating the city traffic, it was already 4:30 by the time they arrived at Ian's residence. Chris felt his nerves acting up, but he knew this was a situation they simply had to face. We see that Ian lived in quite a prestigious building, complete with its own private elevator. Inside the lift, she sensed his anxiety and took his hand with a reassuring smile. He understood that even though this was a performance, they had to make it look real. Ian then curiously asked him how he used to act when he was with his actual girlfriend. She told him to simply do exactly that today, pushing his performance to the very limit. Despite her advice, Chris remained visibly nervous, earning him a playful eye roll from Ian. As they entered the home, we see a middle-aged woman waiting for them. She was busy in the laundry area when Ian called out to her, "Mom." The girl then turned back to Chris and introduced her mother to him properly. He hurried to offer a polite greeting, addressing the lady with the utmost respect. Ian's mother was incredibly kind, pausing her work with the laundry to welcome them. She mentioned that she had already told Ian she wanted her to come home today. Just then, a message from Sue appeared on his phone, leaving Chris suddenly at a loss. He picked up the device and answered, wondering what could be so urgent. She asked how he knew, explaining she had been monitoring the high-level operations closely. The connection was made. Lee had just announced the president would call at 2:30. Privately, he planned to cast Lily aside and take full control of their positions. Chris quickly grabbed the luggage he had brought for Ian's family. He headed straight back toward the city, stopping an electric scooter along the 8-kilometer stretch. The driver moved with surprising speed, weaving through the traffic without hesitation. Chris gripped the luggage tightly with his left hand as they sped along. With his right hand, he hurriedly dialed Lily's number to warn her. The call went to voicemail several times, but he refused to give up and dialed again. She finally answered, immediately telling Chris that she was far too busy to talk. He tried to call her again, but before he could even finish his sentence, she had already hung up on him. He attempted to reach her 3 more times, but each time the screen simply showed that the line was dead. With no other options left, he dialed Sue instead, and to his relief, she answered almost immediately. She asked what was happening, mentioning that she was currently on her way back to the headquarters. He told her he couldn't wait until 2:30 and that he would be there in just a minute. He begged her for a moment of her time, asking her to sneak into the conference room and hide a phone in the corner. He needed her to keep the line open so he could hear exactly what was being discussed inside. Sue was understandably confused, asking him what on earth he was planning to do. He told her not to ask questions as there was no time, simply confirming if she knew the location of the meeting room. He urged her to hurry, and she finally agreed, repeating her compliance as she moved into action. He gripped his phone tightly, constantly urging the driver to push the vehicle to its absolute limit. Soon, Sue's voice came through the hidden phone, signaling that she had successfully planted the device. We hear her addressing Lee, claiming she needed to double-check a specific document before the session began. The meeting was already starting, and Lee coldly remarked that any important matters would have to wait until afterward. After that, Sue's voice faded away, replaced by the muffled, serious tones of the men beginning their discussion. Lee began the meeting by asking for opinions, clearly confident now that he had convened the board on his terms. Chris listened intently, worried that Lee had already secured enough support to officially seize the presidency. The board members were debating the current situation, noting that the instability was hurting the company's stock value. They argued over who was most capable of leading the firm, with many suggesting that Lee had the necessary strength. It was noted that under his recent influence, the company's performance metrics were already 20% higher than last year. One board member noted that while they had choices, Lee seemed the best fit, despite his history of delaying company funds. 6 months had passed without a single explanation from the current leadership, and Lee had already grown bold enough to act. We have to wonder what comes next, and whether the board has already moved to strip the current president of his power. The room fell silent as someone declared the debate over, announcing that the future president had finally arrived. Immediately afterward, Lee's voice rang out, filled with a confidence that was hard to ignore. He noted that everyone had arrived early, offering a brief apology for being held up by an urgent executive matter. Someone pointed out that the chairman hadn't arrived yet, even jokingly wondering if he had decided to retire early. But that was impossible, and soon enough, the chairman's own voice echoed through the room. He asked Lee if he was actually hoping for his absence, suggesting that such a wish would be quite convenient. Lee laughed it off, of course, quickly dismissing the idea as nothing more than a misunderstanding. He then pivoted, stating that they were all there to discuss matters of grave importance for the company's future. It was impossible to ignore the chairman now that he had arrived, and the tension in the room was palpable. The chairman's voice was quiet and surprisingly calm as he gave the order for the proceedings to begin. Several executives then came forward to present a joint proposal for an emergency restructuring of the leadership. We see that this group represented over 40% of the company's administrative distribution. In any normal situation, the board would be expected to respect such a significant and formal request. The chairman looked directly at Lee, his gaze steady and his words remarkably blunt. He insisted he wouldn't let things fall apart, even as accusations flew about the current leadership mishandling public funds. Despite the pressure, the administration still hadn't provided the president with a clear explanation for these financial gaps. Rather than face further rejection, they decided that today would be the day to hold a formal vote on the presidency. To settle things once and for all, they demanded a re-election for the presidency, which caused a sudden shock on the other end of the line. He urged the driver of the electric vehicle to go faster, clearly anxious to reach the meeting as soon as possible. He told the driver not to worry about the cost, complaining that the vehicle didn't seem to be pushing its limits at all. The driver pointed out it was just an electric scooter and couldn't match a motorcycle's speed, which, naturally, was the last thing he wanted to hear. On the other end of the call, there was a heavy, 10-second silence that felt more like a warning than a simple pause. Howard's quiet voice finally came through, asking the board how many of them actually agreed with Lee's plan for a new election. He stated that if more than half agreed, he would accept it, and the room fell into an immediate, uneasy silence. Since Sarah had taken over the company's operations, the improvement in their performance had been impossible to ignore. This year had seen massive growth, and as the vote approached, we can see the room was filled with visible emotion. Howard noted that he hadn't missed a single detail, even the small things that others might have overlooked entirely. He expressed his hope that whoever came next would be even more capable than Sarah had been. He suggested they should at least look at the candidates before deciding whether or not to hold the vote at all. Someone spoke up in support of Lee, who was already carefully considering his next move in this high-stakes game. At that moment, Lee was busy managing the company's affairs on a temporary basis, waiting for his permanent appointment. He claimed that a significant number of shareholders had already thrown their support behind him for the presidency. He even added, with a touch of arrogance, that anyone else who felt qualified was welcome to step forward. He promised that the entire selection process would be handled with complete transparency and fairness. Lee dismissed any objections, stating that it didn't really matter whether everyone agreed with the election process or not. Another voice chimed in, agreeing that the chairman's personal approval was no longer the deciding factor here. One by one, the board members began to declare their support for Lee and his new vision for the company. A massive wave of heated discussion broke out, and we see the atmosphere in the room becoming completely overwhelming. He felt he could only listen as the tide of opinion began to shift away from him. Everything depended on the plan now, and Lee's voice rang out, urging everyone to remain calm. He proposed a simple tally, asking the board members to cast their votes if they agreed with holding an election. Deep down, he knew Lee had been preparing for this for a long time, as a series of messages flashed on the driver's screen. He was almost there. As they turned onto the main street, he realized he had finally arrived at the building. An unfamiliar voice spoke up in the meeting, declaring their full support for the motion. It was Arthur, who controlled 4% of the industry shares, which, as it turns out, was more than enough to matter. Suddenly, the connection became clear. This man was Ben's father. He had always hoped that his son would end up with Sarah, securing a powerful family alliance. But Ben's heart belonged to another employee in his daughter's department, a classic case of inconvenient timing. Lee asked if there were any other candidates, his voice carrying a surprising weight of authority. He stated that if no one else stepped forward, they were prepared to move directly to the final vote. The director asked if they could begin, and with a simple nod, the process was set in motion. Sarah's voice was devoid of emotion, sounding as though she had already resigned herself to the rejection. Another voice chimed in, claiming they had nothing left to say regarding the current proceedings. He urged everyone to choose a leader who could guide the company toward a more prosperous future. The electric scooter finally screeched to a halt right in front of the corporate headquarters. He handed the driver a massive tip of 500,000 and ran inside without looking back once. The security guards immediately stepped in his way, demanding to know what he thought he was doing. The guards asked if he had an appointment, but he ignored them and headed straight for the elevator. He planned to present his evidence, intending to tell everything to the CEO, Edward. The company president had already arrived, and we see him engaged in quiet conversation. He identified himself as Lee's associate, insisting he needed to be at the president's meeting. The security guards hesitated, but eventually, they stepped back and opened the elevator for him. He prepared his proposal, hoping to speak with Edward the moment he reached the top floor. As he ascended to the executive level, the board announced that the voting would begin if there were no further questions. Lee's voice echoed through the room, while our protagonist silently urged them to wait for him. He tried to make a quick call, but to his frustration, no one on the other end could hear him. Suddenly, the phone signal was cut off entirely as the elevator continued its climb. Inside the meeting, the true gravity of the situation remained completely hidden from the members. Was the vote really about to begin? It certainly seemed that way. He felt as though the elevator couldn't move fast enough, and the moment the doors opened, he broke into a sprint. He rushed toward the conference center, reflecting on the days of hard work that led to this moment. He knew this floor well, and within 40 seconds, he had reached the main doors. He could hear the muffled sounds of chaos from within, his own breath coming in heavy gasps. He quickly straightened his appearance, clutching the folder that held the key to setting everything right. Without a second thought, he pushed the heavy doors of the conference center wide open. The noise inside vanished instantly, replaced by a wave of pure astonishment from the crowd. Every eye in the room turned toward him, including Lee, who watched him with utter disbelief. The room was filled with shock, but our protagonist remained perfectly calm despite the heavy atmosphere. Lee stood up abruptly, demanding to know what he thought he was doing there. He asked who had allowed him entry, but our man didn't even spare him a glance. He walked straight to Edward and told him he had gathered all the evidence and was ready to announce it. He gave the CEO a choice. Edward could announce the investigation results himself, or let him do it. Edward told him to go ahead, speaking with a chilling calmness as our protagonist took his place behind him. We see him step forward with his phone in hand, facing the gathered board of directors. The room was packed with high-level executives, all waiting to see what would happen next. He sent the data to Edward's terminal, requesting that the contents be displayed on the main screen. It was time for everyone to see the results of their investigation for themselves. Edward complied immediately, announcing to the executives that the findings were about to be revealed. He connected his device, noting that everyone knew the shopping channel had faced numerous issues lately. The channel's products, especially the high-priced items, had been under heavy criticism for some time. He reminded them that the CEO had personally asked him to conduct a secret investigation into the matter. He announced that he had finally secured all the information and directed their attention to the big screen. The screen flickered to life, displaying the details of the first supplier involved in the scheme. He began to explain that the legal representative of this particular company was a man named Daniel. For many years, Lee had collaborated with him, and this was how their shopping contracts were structured. As the contracts appeared, he noted that this company conveniently vanished shortly after the partnership began. Lee had tried to dodge his responsibilities, but his excuses were being systematically dismantled. After that, we see Ryan turn his attention back to his colleague to keep the momentum going. He asked Luke to display the information regarding the second company on the screen. And there it was, the legal representative of this second entity. It was Daniel once again, and the entire cycle of transactions had simply repeated itself. Just like before, as soon as the shopping contracts were finalized, the company vanished into thin air. He clicked the screen again, revealing that the third and fourth companies had met the exact same fate. In recent years, Ryan had been sourcing low-quality products and passing them off to the customers. Whenever a problem arose, Ryan would simply spend a fortune to buy off the representatives. Meanwhile, Daniel had already moved on and signed a contract with the next shell company. At this point, it became clear to everyone in the room that these companies were mere shadows. But the real question remained, how could the firm possibly keep finding this same man over and over? A middle-aged, stout executive stood up in a rage, claiming that our protagonist was lying. He demanded to know where these lies came from, threatening that there would be consequences without an explanation. Our man told him not to be so nervous, calmly stating that the truth would be explained momentarily. First, he suggested they discuss the true identity of this mysterious Daniel. Before he could finish, Ryan suddenly lost control, shouting about how foolish the situation had become. He tried to cut the presentation short, but Mr. Chun, an elder with a stern expression, intervened. He reminded everyone that as shareholders, they had every right to know the full truth. The old man told our protagonist to continue, as he was listening very intently. It turned out that Daniel was actually the husband of Danielle, the general manager of finance. We see him explain that the purchasing department and its operations simply cannot be separated from these prearranged executions. The department continued its shopping spree, all while collecting fees behind the scenes. That was the trick, really, a scheme they had likely spent a great deal of time perfecting. Lately, Danielle's company had been dealing with some very strange suppliers for their goods. But those suppliers never mentioned this secret, and to be honest, the truth speaks for itself. Today, the board was supposed to choose a new leader for the firm. Hoping for honesty, our protagonist placed Danielle's phone at the front so everyone could hear the evidence. As he offered a formal apology, the doors to Danielle's meeting room were abruptly closed. A minute later, the elders were so enraged they nearly overturned the tables. The purchasing department, the logistics team, and the finance office were all implicated. Seeking a resolution, he suggested to the president that the current agenda be cleared immediately. Leo was known as an honorable man, and he was the first to raise his hand in agreement. He declared his support for his sister to continue her tenure as president. First, they needed to address the greed within the ranks before they could even discuss an election. One by one, the others chimed in, echoing their agreement with the proposal. They all raised their hands, signaling that the presidential vote could not proceed under these circumstances. The chairman, Mr. Lee, didn't end the session just yet. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Ryan. He addressed Ryan directly, telling him that as a key executive, he needed to explain this mess. He demanded a full explanation for all the shareholders within the next 3 days. He asked if Ryan could handle that, though deep down, the man was clearly feeling quite uneasy. We see that Ryan was fully aware that Leo and Danielle were working as a team. He wondered if he should let him speak, feeling a bit conflicted about whether to reach out to Leo. Leo watched him closely, while our protagonist shared a subtle, knowing glance with Danielle. Danielle's face had gone pale. He was clearly caught off guard by the sudden turn of events. Danielle's operations had always been steady, systematically draining the company every time he collaborated with others. The atmosphere in the room began to shift as the tension started to settle slightly. He wanted to keep things clean, yet he felt the urge to suggest a direct partnership with the chairman. It was a frustrating situation, but he knew that staying patient was the only way to keep everyone on the same page. Later, back at the office, Theo slammed the files onto the desk before giving Danielle an enthusiastic, celebratory hug. He told her she had been amazing and had single-handedly saved herself from a very dangerous situation today. He then asked how long she had been working with Mike on this investigation without telling him. To be honest, he had been worried sick about her for quite some time. She playfully called him a silly boy and told him to let go before he squeezed the life out of her. Danielle gave him a gentle pat on the back, asking why he hadn't mentioned he was so well prepared. Theo finally let her go with a grin, admitting that Mike's sudden appearance had been a complete surprise. Danielle looked skeptical, while Theo glanced between her and our protagonist with an amused expression. She asked if he was truly telling the truth or just trying to pull her leg again. He insisted he wasn't, and as he looked over, our protagonist gave a confident thumbs up in return. Theo joked that the constant pressure was getting to him, even when no one was looking his way. But he finally admitted that she was impressive, promising he wouldn't let her make any more mistakes. Theo and our protagonist shared a long look, though Theo seemed far more interested in his own affairs at that moment. Mike and our protagonist were left to talk, while Sophie noted that the two of them were finally alone in the office. Sophie sighed, admitting that she really hadn't been looking forward to this particular conversation. He asked her why she found all of this so easy to endure, a small smile playing on his lips. He wondered why she hadn't used the information he'd provided earlier regarding Danielle and her operations. After all, it was common knowledge that Danielle was the chairman's right hand. Sophie's expression shifted to one of disappointment, knowing that an internal conflict with Danielle would be far more difficult. The chairman was merely a weapon for the other side, and the team backing him was incredibly formidable. As long as Danielle was the one handling things, it felt as though nothing could truly be changed. Having recently taken over at the company, he felt his foundation was still far too unstable for such a move. He didn't want to destroy their working relationship, but today, he had truly been pushed to his limit. He told himself he would continue to seek peace, no matter what the cost might be. Sophie looked skeptical, wondering if seeking peace at any price was even a realistic goal. Theo asked for clarification, not quite understanding if that was what our protagonist had actually done. By having the chairman investigate Danielle and the heads of the purchasing department, he had set a trap. Wasn't that simply a way to force him into making a fatal mistake? At the time, he would act in secret, ensuring Danielle was removed so that the rest of the world could move on. They would continue to live in peace, which, to be honest, was exactly what he had intended all along. A small gasp escaped Sophie's lips as a subtle, knowing smile crossed his face. Instead of answering, he simply looked at Mike and asked what kind of person she truly was. Mike felt a wave of discomfort wash over her, wondering why he was suddenly asking such pointed questions about her character. She hesitated, unsure of what to say, but he simply encouraged her to speak her mind freely. He wanted to know her true thoughts, as he had been harboring his own doubts for quite some time now. She told him that he was the type who would never stop until he reached his goals, which felt like a heavy accusation. He paused, asking himself if he really was the kind of person who would let nothing stand in his way. The atmosphere became quite tense, and to be honest, finding the right words was becoming increasingly difficult for both of them. For instance, she pointed out how he had reported to Sarah just to ensure that Lily wouldn't face any blame. It didn't need to be so extreme, yet he had done it anyway to achieve his specific ends. Lily took a deep breath and mentioned that, on another note, his father's medical treatments were finally being arranged. She noted that he didn't seem to care that Leo held so much power over their current situation. It seemed he wasn't even bothered by the misuse of public funds. His only focus was on getting the job done. And that was the core of it. He simply wouldn't stop until he arrived exactly where he wanted to be. He expressed his sincere gratitude, knowing how exhausted his father had become over these last few difficult years. If he hadn't stepped in, there was no telling how much more his father would have had to suffer. He dismissed the thanks, reminding her that she had been a great help to him as well. We see them share a few more words before he finally decides it is time to head home. 2 days later, on a quiet evening with nothing on his schedule, he found himself wandering through the city streets. He checked his social media feed and noticed that Lily had posted a new update just a minute ago. It was a simple photo of the city lights, and though he hadn't scrolled far, it caught his attention immediately. He remembered her number and reached out. Since she wasn't asleep yet, she replied almost instantly. He asked her exactly where she was, offering to come and pick her up right then and there. She felt a bit uneasy, explaining that she was currently heading back to her apartment complex. When she asked why the sudden offer, he admitted her social media post made him feel her heart needed a place to rest. Since he was already out wandering the streets, she finally agreed and told him to come get her. Lily promised to take him somewhere where his mind could truly relax, which sounded like a welcome change. She immediately pulled out her phone and sent him her current location so he could find her. He borrowed a car from a family friend named Joe, and we see him arrive just 10 minutes later. Lily was already waiting by the curb, holding a cup of milk tea in her hand. She didn't notice him at first, and when he finally approached, she looked quite surprised by his speed. She teased him for being so fast, asking why he wouldn't hurry when a chance to relax was waiting. He laughed as he started the car, promising her a truly first-class tour of the city. Without a second thought, she simply climbed into the passenger seat and settled in. She didn't show even a hint of hesitation, which, to be honest, made him feel a little bit awkward. Once he was behind the wheel, he noticed she was still happily nursing that milk tea. He couldn't help but ask if it was really that delicious, wondering why she seemed so obsessed with it. She offered him a sip so he could judge for himself, handing the cup over with a smile. She told him it had a distinct tea flavor and encouraged him to try it, even if he thought he'd dislike it. He took a sip of the milk tea, tasting the rich leaves through the same straw she had used. It had a light, pleasant fragrance, and he had to admit the taste was actually quite good. She looked at him with eyes full of expectation, silently asking if he finally believed she wasn't lying. He admitted it was actually quite good, carefully placing the milk tea back into the cup holder. But he couldn't help but point out that she didn't really need to be posting on social media while out in the evening rush. Lily simply smiled, noting that after hearing his voice, she realized her heart truly did need a place to rest. And so, we see them set off together to find a quiet spot where they could both finally relax. He shut down his thoughts for a moment while she tucked her phone away, finally giving the world her full attention. Half an hour later, they arrived at a secluded temple by a massive lake, a hidden gem near the outskirts of the city. He had often come here to deliver food in the past, but this was his very first time visiting under the cover of night. Lily was the first to climb up toward the lakeside, teasing him for walking so slowly, as if he were already 80 years old. He sat down at a long wooden table where the air smelled of the lake, watching the bright moon's reflection dance on the water as the world grew still. Lily finally hopped over to sit beside him, asking if he liked the place and if his heart felt at peace yet. As he turned to look at her, the wind caught her hair and carried her scent toward him. She caught his gaze and asked why he was staring so intently. He took a deep breath and leaned back, looking into the distance as he began to reveal that he never really knew his father growing up. He recalled a middle school assignment about fathers where he couldn't write a single word, leaving his classmates staring at his blank page. His father had sent money in secret, so they lived well despite his mother not working, which led to cruel rumors among his peers. His mother had sacrificed everything for their education, and as the memories surfaced, he felt a pang of old, familiar pain. He felt he hadn't been able to protect her back then, and Lily, sensing his sorrow, leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered about their shared misfortunes. She confessed that she did everything for her family's sake, even the things she regretted, and softly offered him an apology for her past actions. She began to cry more openly, her body trembling as her tears soaked his shoulder, and in that moment, he realized he wasn't the only one hurting. He held her tightly, worried his own unease might show, but in the silence of the night, they simply found comfort in each other's arms. She didn't pull away, but after a long while, she softly mentioned the chill in the air, prompting him to finally let go so they could head back. She asked if he had any spare clothes in the car, wanting to sit for a while, but as they walked along the beach, the biting cold made staying still impossible. He held her coat close, wanting to reach for her hand, but hesitating out of fear of being too forward, while she simply tried to manage the weight of her own stress. He spoke softly, noting how open spaces help one relax, while she admitted she had grown used to coming here just to feel trapped and cry in private. But then, he interrupted her with a sudden request, asking if she could stop addressing him by his full name, Sam. He wondered if she could just call him by his name, admitting it felt strange when she was so formal, as if she only saw him as a casual acquaintance. She admitted she was afraid of making him angry, but he just smiled, noting that the world needs close friends, especially since she had already cried in front of him. He asked her directly if, after everything, she still truly considered him to be just an ordinary friend. His voice was light as he told her he wouldn't be angry. In fact, it would make him quite happy if she spoke to him more familiarly. Sensing a kindred spirit in him, she suddenly shifted the conversation, asking how things were going at the office lately. Specifically, she wanted to know if Leo was still causing him trouble or looking for reasons to pick a fight. She asked about the investigation into Dan, unable to understand why he had assigned Dan himself to lead the inquiry. It seemed counterintuitive, given that everyone knew Dan was Leo's right-hand man, but Sam just gave a small, knowing smile about that board meeting. He explained that by doing it publicly, he forced everyone to see that Dan would naturally try to protect himself and cover his tracks. His tone became decisive as he explained that during the meeting, he held Dan accountable for misappropriating company funds, moving beyond simple internal politics. Now Dan faced a real judgment, and with the scandal out in the open, Leo wouldn't be able to protect him without appearing complicit himself. It was a clever trap. If Leo protected Dan, he'd lose credibility, and Sam was curious to see how his rival would react to such a calculated move. She hadn't expected him to be so cautious and tactical, realizing he had orchestrated a massive plan right under everyone's noses with the chairman's support. We see that while he has a vulnerable side, he is also a serious contender who has endured much, and she felt a surge of genuine happiness for his success. Suddenly, he stopped to look at her, wondering where she had obtained her data and who was helping her behind the scenes. When the chairman finally received the news, he simply closed his eyes, wondering if a new alliance was about to be signed. The chairman wondered if he should thank him personally, but we see he had another important task in mind, a potential alliance between Sophie and Sam. It was a connection no one had anticipated, as they seemed to have no prior link. When asked if she disliked him, she chose to remain silent. He told her that if she truly felt uncomfortable, she should speak up, though she admitted she simply hadn't expected him to seek such a meeting. They both knew that the fewer people involved in the investigation into Sam's wife, the better. After all, this wasn't exactly a public matter. Sophie smiled and noted the late hour, and by 1:30 in the morning, he finally returned to the bar after dropping her off at home. Old Lou was still awake, reading by the soft light of the living room. He left the car keys on the table as a silent thank you before heading out. The following Sunday afternoon, Sophie called to suggest they visit his parents at the hospital, mentioning that the staff were discussing an upgrade for them. He knew he couldn't control their stubbornness, so he took a deep breath and agreed to go immediately, glad that she had remembered them. He arrived at Sophie's bar around 6 in the evening, finding her there alone, surrounded by the quiet hum of the empty establishment. Looking at the mountain of unfinished paperwork upstairs, he couldn't help but ask if she was in desperate need of an assistant. She assured him she could handle it, but then, with a playful glint in her eye, she told him to report to her office the next morning. He joked that she first owed him a new electric scooter to replace the one he lost, prompting Sophie to look up from her files with an amused stare. She promised to help him buy one, provided he kept his word about working every morning, so he quickly changed the subject to hide his embarrassment. He suggested that they should probably head to the hospital first, which, to be honest, was a very convenient distraction. She didn't press the issue, and soon they were at the hospital, where they found Sophie already comfortably chatting with his father in the private room. His mother was tidying up while Sophie, having brought plenty of bread and supplies, made herself quite at home with the family. Suddenly, his brother asked if they were planning to make their relationship official, a question that left both Sophie and him momentarily stunned. His father watched them closely as he set some fruit on the table, telling his son there was no reason to be so afraid of the truth. Sophie seemed to agree, teasingly asking if he was worried that his parents might actually disapprove of their being together. His mother took the suggestion quite seriously, and as he scrambled to explain away the brother's nonsense, she simply nodded in quiet approval. Sophie's presence was clearly working wonders, and we see the father jokingly asking if Sam could even stand up to her level of care. Sophie just laughed it off, telling the girl not to say such things, while Sam sat by his father, noting how sharp the old man still was. He overheard them discussing the move to a private suite, realizing they had only been there a few days and hadn't planned on a week-long stay. His father's eyes widened at the cost, as the daily rate exceeded $600, a sum he insisted he simply couldn't pay. The old man was desperate to go home just to save money, and Sam, feeling a bit awkward, had to firm up his voice to insist on the upgrade. His father's voice grew even stronger, and suddenly, what felt like a small family war was about to explode right there in the room. Sam had to raise his own voice, reminding him that after spending millions on his recovery, they just wanted him to get better gradually. He asked his father if he could understand that they weren't about to worry over a few extra dollars for hospital observation. The father snapped back that he knew his own body and didn't need any stupid advice, leaving Sam's mother to rush in and try to calm them down. She told them to play nice, but the father turned to Sophie with a much softer face, wanting to chat with the thin girl instead of his son. He told his nephew not to be angry, as the cost of a room was nothing at all, a statement he made quite loudly for Sophie's benefit. He then sent Sam and Sophie out to buy some lunch, wanting a private word with Sam's brother, who followed the mother out with a friendly glance. The brother even gave Sam a playful wink on his way out, leaving only the father and Sam alone in the quiet of the room. After a long silence, the father admitted he was worried Sophie might see the family as a financial burden if she chose to be with Sam. Sam tried to explain that he wasn't actually dating Sophie and that the family was just making things up, but his father wasn't listening. The old man dismissed the gossip, saying he and the mother could see for themselves that Sophie was a wonderful girl who suited Sam perfectly. He noted that the family already saw them as a couple and that she clearly respected them, so why wouldn't they want to be together? Sam practically begged him to be realistic, insisting they couldn't be together, but his father just smiled, convinced his son was the best catch around. He claimed he could see Sophie was interested too, and when Sam tried to drop the subject, the old man threatened to get out of bed right then and there. The father looked at him happily, telling Sam the decision was his, but that he and the mother had already decided they liked Sophie very much. Sam promised his father that if he just stayed in bed, they would discuss other things later. When Sam returned, he brought 6 dishes from a restaurant, 4 meat and 2 vegetables. He also had a bowl of pork bone soup and fresh meat. His father, seeing the spread, couldn't believe his eyes and immediately worried about how much it all cost. The old man cried out again, feeling terrible about the money, but Sam just laughed it off, telling him it was a small price for his happiness and that he'd even bring Sophie home. He suggested his mother prepare fried chicken, and seeing his father finally eat his fill, the mother couldn't help but smile with pure joy as she planned the meal. The atmosphere felt a bit strange to Sam, and after dinner, as he and Sophie left the hospital, he decided to explain that his parents had said some rather silly things that day. He told her not to take them seriously, but she already knew the reason. They had implied she was their daughter-in-law, and Sam insisted he knew a relationship was impossible. Suddenly, she caught him off guard with a pointed question, asking him why, if that were the case, he was trying so hard to hide from her. For a moment, Sam was utterly speechless, his face turning red all the way to his shoulders. Realizing she saw right through him, he grabbed a drink to hide his embarrassment. He made an excuse about needing to buy a light and walked away before she could respond. The next day, his friend Gary invited him for a drink to discuss some news. It turned out that a woman named Diana and her husband had been caught up in something serious. We have to wonder what exactly happened there. Diana had been taken away during an afternoon meeting at her company, still in her professional attire. Rumors were swirling that she had been arrested. It seemed she had been cheated and her assets were mortgaged. With Friday approaching, Sam expected even more explosive news regarding Diana's downfall. He quickly called a friend named Nina, who already knew the situation. She revealed that Diana's grandmother had gone to the authorities, and now the whole family was in trouble. While at a guest's house, Sam told Nina he was heading to the police station. She asked if it was an emergency and if he needed any help. Nina was always loyal, and Sam immediately left the restaurant to head to the station. It had been a long time since he'd seen her, and he wondered if she'd even remember him. He also thought of a girl named Lily, whose last hopes were likely turning into grief. At the station, he saw Nina in her uniform, looking very professional. She was handing documents to an elderly man, but when she spotted Sam entering, she told her colleague she needed a break and signaled for him to follow. They met near the back entrance of a nearby hotel where Nina was already waiting. She looked sharp in her fitted uniform as she greeted him as a brother. She teased him, noting that he had finally decided to come find her after all this time, despite never making an effort to visit her before. She suggested he didn't really want to see her, but then she cut him off, asking if he actually had a good reason for showing up now. She challenged him directly, asking if he dared to deny that he'd never once made an effort to come find her. Sam couldn't deny it, promising to be more attentive before jokingly suggesting a movie date, though he worried she was far too popular for him. He teased that Nina always had excuses to reject him, but then suggested they go visit her grandmother and little Lily together. He thanked her for her hard work, noting how happy it made everyone, and wondered aloud who had encouraged her to join the force. We learned that Lily's mother, Diana, still hadn't been found and was now considered a fugitive, which weighed heavily on Sam's mind. Nina asked if he still recognized the girl, and Sam proudly recalled holding her, even jokingly asking if she still wanted to kiss him. On the 3rd floor of the hotel, they found Lily writing at a table while her grandmother cooked, the old woman's face lighting up as she took Sam's hand. She greeted him warmly, asking how he had been and playfully noting that he seemed to have put on a little weight recently. Sam insisted everything was fine despite the hard work, as the grandmother called Lily over to see their unexpected guest standing nearby. The little girl took a step forward and hugged him tightly, as he asked if she was happy living back at her father's house. When asked about kindergarten, Lily began to complain and pull away, and we have to wonder what was making her so unhappy there. She confessed that while she liked school, home life was miserable and she preferred being with her grandmother, who struggled to hold back tears. Sam asked the grandmother if she was involved in the girl's care, but the old woman simply noted that young people's education must come first. He didn't have the heart to tell her that Diana's arrest was connected to them, so they simply chatted with the elderly woman for a while. As they left the building, Nina asked if the grandmother knew that they were the ones responsible for Diana being taken away. Sam wondered if the old woman would hate them, though he realized she was far more understanding than most people would be. Nina worried that if the legal process continued, the parents wouldn't be seen for years, just as Lily had finally reunited with her father. He suggested that if she felt that way, she should use this chance to investigate the bridge case and perhaps find a middle ground. Deep down, he felt a girl was better off with her mother, even if that mother was currently caught in a terrifying situation. After a long day of doing very little, Sam returned home to spend a quiet moment at his bar before heading out for some fresh air. As the streetlights flickered to life, two red high heels suddenly appeared before him, and following the line of those shoes, Sam looked up. It was Lily, standing right there in front of him, and she asked if he had been there long. He didn't mention how long he'd waited, simply greeting her and asking if she felt welcome at his place. Of course she was welcome. He stood up in his family's bar, which the old man ran entirely with his support, and asked what she'd like to drink. She wanted a coffee made by his own hands, so Lily found a seat in the lounge area, while Sam wondered if he even looked like someone who knew how to brew coffee. The old man chuckled from behind the bar and offered a quick demonstration. A few minutes later, Sam served the coffee and sat down to let the old man enjoy the scene. He wondered if there was some other motive at play, or if there was someone else she usually spent her time talking to. She seemed skeptical, asking if there was anyone else like him, but Sam decided not to speak as he felt a wave of hunger and dissatisfaction after a long, empty day. He offered to buy her dinner, momentarily forgetting his own mood, and asked why she had arrived so late. After all, he wondered if she had really just come all this way for a simple cup of coffee. Lily's eyes welled up slightly as we see her seeking him out, suddenly remembering her role as the primary driver for the company's interests. The moment was interrupted by their shared history, and he couldn't help but wonder if she still wanted him in her life. The company was preparing for a new election to choose the president, a race in which Lily had previously been unsuccessful. Later, Sam's own position was approved, and as they faced the upcoming elections, a man named Dan claimed to support him, though Sam had his doubts. He was certain there was more to Dan's sudden outreach, especially since Dan had noticed Sam was struggling to manage his workload lately. Dan was now handling the responsibilities related to Sam's work, leading Lily to ask if the man had tried to sell him a car. Sam was sure Dan wouldn't mention it, but after a sip of coffee, he told Lily that lying was useless. Dan had indeed offered to buy him a new car. Dan had a close relationship with Sam's father, and Sam even called him uncle, yet Lily had refused his favors, preferring the convenience of the bus or company cars. He joked about giving her millions instead, wondering if he could finally show a bit of ambition for once. He didn't worry about the answer, as we have to wonder if that man's only true hope was simply to make more money. Sam asked if she didn't think the man was a strong competitor, but when she tried to cut him off, he quickly changed the subject to tell her how beautiful she looked. Lily watched him with a certain intensity before leading him toward the old part of the city, though she wondered aloud if such a place could really be exciting. He admitted he had hardly ever explored that area, so she offered to be his guide, noting that the history of the old bay was very much real. He found himself genuinely liking the atmosphere, which made him think of new shops and a changing city, though he tried to keep his mind clear of heavy thoughts. He simply wanted to let his mind wander for a moment, drifting through thoughts of the future and the changes yet to come. Suddenly, she stumbled and hurt her leg. Seeing her eyes fill with tears, Sam instinctively reached out to steady her, placing a hand on her shoulder. He helped her sit down to check if she was all right, realizing it was just a minor fall, when he spotted an old man nearby, pushing a motorcycle. The man was selling traditional candy, so Sam told Lily to wait there, though she gripped his sleeve, afraid he might actually leave her behind. He spent $5 on a piece of candy to cheer her up, but by the time he returned, Lily seemed more annoyed than comforted by the gesture. A small crowd had gathered, and some were even recording the scene with their phones, so Sam quietly urged her to just accept the candy. With so many eyes on them and tears still blurring her vision, Lily finally took the treat and reached out her hand for him to help her up. It was the first time he had truly felt how delicate her hands were, and for a moment, they both stood there as she looked at him with a new expression. He joked that someone might post a video claiming he was too cheap to buy her something better than candy, wondering what kind of secret they were now sharing. She teased that the viewers might say a mean older brother was tricking a little girl with sweets, though he looked at her and wondered what little girl she meant. Deciding not to push the joke, he eventually brought Lily back to the bar and up to the second floor, where his bedroom sat right next to the old man's room. She was surprised he could live in such a small space, but he explained that the modest bed was comfortable enough since he didn't need much room for his things. He lay back on the mattress to show her how surprisingly comfortable it was, inviting her to see for herself that he didn't need a grand mansion to be content. To his surprise, she actually lay her head down on his arm, and in that quiet moment, she softly asked if his wrist was hurting him. He held her there, looking at the simple bed and remarking that while it was certainly firmer than the luxury beds at the Grand Hotel, it suited him just fine. Lily noted how hard the surface felt, but Sam just smiled, claiming that sleeping on a firm bed was actually a traditional secret for staying healthy. Sam insisted there was nothing wrong with his shoulder, gently placing his hand on Lily's waist and asking if he wasn't more comfortable than the bed. She didn't move or pull away, and to be honest, Sam found it nearly impossible not to hold her when she looked that beautiful. But before he could say another word, Lily gave him a sharp shove to the chest that made him yelp before she stood up and looked down at him. The next morning, we see Sam rushing out of bed to find her, eventually spotting her on the balcony looking out at the morning view. He watched as the old man busied himself downstairs, moving things around the small parking area with his usual quiet focus. Sam then set about preparing some simple dishes, perhaps hoping a good meal would smooth over the awkwardness of the previous night. He imagined inviting his friends over for a drink, or perhaps just spending a quiet afternoon in the garden, enjoying the simple things. There were still things to fix, of course, but he promised himself he would eventually build a proper place for her to rest. She looked at him then, asking if he truly expected her to enjoy staying in such a modest place. He gave her his word that he did, and for the moment, the matter seemed settled. She teased him, asking if the whole place didn't feel a bit like a cluttered old grocery store. He simply asked why she couldn't just enjoy the charm of it, noting that many guests found the atmosphere quite welcoming. It wasn't a bad life, really, and the timing of his work shifts allowed him plenty of freedom. You're right about that, he conceded as she prepared to leave, while Lily watched him with an unreadable expression. He told her that if he found the time, he would come looking for her again to take her back to the old part of the city. He even offered to buy her more of that traditional candy, promising to be her guide once more. No need, she replied curtly, though she couldn't resist calling him a dummy as she turned away. We hear the rhythmic sound of her footsteps fading away as she made her way down the stairs. Sam lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling and reflecting on the strange turn his life had taken. He found himself thinking that perhaps starting a small fruit garden wouldn't be such a bad idea after all. On the following morning, we see Sam preparing to head out, clearly ready to put his new ideas into motion. Downstairs, the old man was already busy cleaning the first floor, moving with his usual quiet and steady rhythm. He looked up in surprise, naturally, wondering if Sam being up this early meant he had finally found a new job. Sam told him no, explaining that he was actually heading to the flower market to buy some fruit plants for his garden. The old man was puzzled by the sudden interest, noting that he and Lily had already gone out to buy some plants just yesterday. To Sam, this felt like a stroke of genuine good fortune, as if the universe was finally starting to cooperate with his plans.